Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling to Orlando, Florida, to a story about dreams that turned into nightmares. A story about a house that was supposed to be a home, about promises that were really lies, and about a woman who deserved so much better than what she got. This is the story of Shanti Cooper. Let's start at the beginning, before everything fell apart, before the house, before the lies unraveled, when there was still hope. Shanti Matani was born on January 22nd, 1979. From the very start, she was someone special, the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in. Her friends described her as intelligent, empathetic, warm. She had this smile that made you feel like everything would be okay. By her early 30s, Shanti had built a life for herself. She married a man named Jim Cooper, and in 2010 they welcomed their son Jackson into the world. Shanti poured everything into motherhood. Jackson wasn't just her son, he was her entire world, her reason for breathing, her motivation for everything she did. But marriage isn't always what we hope it will be. Over time, Shanti and Jim grew apart. They argued. The love they'd once shared began to fracture, and in 2013 they made the difficult decision to divorce. It wasn't easy. They fought for custody of Jackson. Eventually they agreed to share him, each parent getting time with their beloved boy. Shanti didn't let the divorce define her. She was stronger than that. She launched her own financial software business and ran it right from her home office. She was good at it too. Her business thrived. She was independent, successful, providing for her son. She had her tight circle of friends who loved her fiercely. Life was moving forward. And then she decided to try love again. In March 2013, around the same time her divorce was being finalized, Shanti joined Match.com. She was cautiously optimistic, opening herself up to the possibility of finding someone new, someone who could be a partner, a stepfather to Jackson, someone to build a future with. That's when she met Dave Trans. Dave was living up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. At the time, he was going through his own divorce from his wife, Carol. He was 11 years older than Shanti, and he seemed stable, intelligent, successful. He told her he'd inherited millions from his father, somewhere between $4 and $6 million. He painted a picture of financial security, of a man who had his life together. They started messaging back and forth on the dating site, then emails. Long emails. The kind where you stay up too late because you're so engrossed in the conversation, you lose track of time. They'd text throughout the day, every day. Despite the distance between Florida and Minnesota, they grew close. Shanti was smitten. In a document found later on her computer, she wrote to Dave, "Dave, I will have to say I think this will be a delicious detour. Amazing, magnificent, life-changing detour. A life-changing detour." She had no idea how true those words would be. After months of long-distance courtship, Dave made a decision. He packed up his life in Minnesota and moved to Orlando to be with Shanti and her young son. It was romantic. It was a grand gesture. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful. In April 2015, Dave Trone found a house. Not just any house, his dream house. It sat in Delaney Park, an upscale neighborhood in Orlando. The property was stunning. 4,000 square feet of Victorian architecture, complete with decorative gargoyles perched on the exterior. It had a pool, a garage, and even a separate apartment above the garage. It was the kind of house that made you stop and stare as you drove by. The realtor Tara Stevens sold it to Dave for just over $600,000. He paid cash. Or rather, he put it in a trust in his mother's name. Even though Shanti was in his life, Even though they were building a future together, her name wasn't on any of the paperwork. But Shanti didn't seem worried about that. She believed in Dave. She believed in his millions, in his promises. And she loved that house. In February 2017, Shanti and Dave got married. They were going to make that house their family home. They, along with Jackson, would create memories there. But first it needed work. Renovations. Improvements. They wanted to transform it into something truly spectacular. Dave took charge of overseeing the renovation project. After all, he was the one with the vision, the one with the inheritance money. Shanti would keep running her business from home, taking care of Jackson, managing the day-to-day responsibilities, and Dave would handle the house. Except, Dave didn't actually have any money. The millions he told Shanti about, they didn't exist. They'd never existed. It was all a lie. The renovation began with hope and excitement. But Dave's vision was ambitious. Perhaps too ambitious. He insisted on tearing down most of the interior walls. He wanted an open concept design, something modern and striking. The contractors started demolition, and they kept demolishing and demolishing, until one day local contractor Keith Orey got a call from Dave asking him to come take a look at the project. Keith Orey was no stranger to challenging renovations. He was actually the host of a reality TV show called Zombie House Flipping, where he and his team took dilapidated houses and brought them back to life. He'd seen some disasters in his time, but when he walked into the Tron house, even he was shocked. I wasn't at all prepared for what I saw when I got there, Orey later recalled. They had fully disassembled this house to a degree that I'd never seen before. It was rather astonishing. The couple had stripped away all the interior dividing walls. What remained was essentially a two-story shell. An engineer came out to assess the structure and discovered something terrifying. The only thing holding up the entire house was 2 inches of stucco. The building was structurally unsound. Dangerous. Keith Orey could have walked away. Any reasonable person would have. But he saw it as a challenge. A bold, audacious challenge. So he agreed to help. He began shoring up the interior, trying to make the house safe again, trying to salvage what could be saved. But this was going to cost money. A lot of money. And remember, Dave didn't have any money. Shanti was the one with the successful business. So Shanti became the one paying for everything. The renovations, the bills, their living expenses, everything. Her friends started noticing things. He always talked about how he had a ton of money. One friend, Melissa Brzezinski, later told police. But she couldn't figure out why he was such a miser. The renovation costs spiraled. $20,000, $50,000, $100,000. By the time they were deep into the project, Shanti had poured nearly $250,000 into that house. $250,000. And her name still wasn't on the deed. As the renovation dragged on through 2016 and into 2017, the main house became unlivable. It was too dangerous, too much of a construction zone, so the family moved into the small one-bedroom apartment above the garage. Shanti ran her entire financial software business out of that cramped space. She lived there, worked there, tried to maintain some sense of normalcy for Jackson. And Dave started sleeping downstairs in the garage, on the couch with the dogs. Think about that for a moment. They were married, supposedly in love, supposedly building a life together. But they were sleeping in separate spaces. The physical distance between them was a reflection of the emotional distance growing day by day. Shanti was starting to realize that something was very wrong. She began keeping journals, writing down her thoughts and feelings. In those private pages, she wrote about feeling neglected, ignored. She expressed frustration with Dave, with the marriage, with how everything had turned out so differently than she'd imagined. Her friends were worried too. They saw how stressed she was, how the renovation had become this consuming monster that ate up all her money and all her peace of mind. Some of them started to actively distrust Dave. They felt he'd misled Shanti, that he wasn't who he'd claimed to be. And they were right, because Dave was hiding more than just the fact that he had no money. Investigators would later discover that Dave was a frequent visitor to Club Orlando, a same-sex bathhouse. Witnesses there confirmed they'd seen him engaged in sexual acts with other men. He'd been there approximately 70 times. This was a part of his life that Shanti likely knew nothing about. Another secret. Another lie. By early 2018, the marriage was falling apart. The renovation had become a money pit, bleeding Shanti dry financially and emotionally. She was living in a tiny apartment, her dream house still just a construction site, her husband sleeping in the garage, and her business suffering because she couldn't focus. But Dave had a plan to fix everything. Or so he thought. Remember Keith Ori, the contractor who'd come in to help salvage the house? Well, he had an idea. His show, Zombie House Flipping, specialized in exactly these kinds of disaster renovations. What if the Trones house could be featured on the show? They could get expert help, the renovation would be completed, and everyone would win. Dave loved this idea. He was obsessed with it, actually. In his mind, this was the solution to all their problems. The show would fix the house. They'd recover from the financial disaster. Everything would go back to being perfect. There was just one problem. Shanti had to agree to appear on the show. In April 2018, Keith Ori arranged a final meeting with Dave and Shanti to make sure they were both on board with the plan. The show was supposed to start filming in May. Everything was lined up. They just needed both of them to say yes. Shanti came to that meeting. She listened to the pitch, and according to Keith Ori, something was clearly wrong. They both agreed and said, "Yes, we understand," Ori recalled. And then she took off immediately. I got a sense that she was pissed off at him. Some people who knew Shanti believed she'd finally had enough. She was done pouring money into this disaster, done pretending everything was fine, done being the only one sacrificing. Friends later said they thought Shanti was planning to leave Dave, that she'd decided this marriage, this house, this whole situation was a mistake she needed to walk away from. But she never got the chance. April 24th, 2018. Started like any other day. Jackson, who was 8 years old at the time, went to school that morning. Shanti was supposed to pick him up that afternoon, like she always did. She was a devoted mother. She never missed picking up her son. But that day she didn't show up. The school called Jim Cooper, Shanti's ex-husband and Jackson's father. He picked up his son, concerned about why Shanti hadn't come. Something felt wrong. So Jim and Jackson drove to the house in Delaney Park. When they arrived, they saw police tape, officers everywhere. Something terrible had happened. Earlier that afternoon, at around 3:30 p.m., Dave Trani had called 911. The call was frantic, emotional. "My wife," he told the operator, his voice breaking. "I found my wife. She's not breathing. I tried to do CPR. I can't get her to breathe." When first responders arrived, they found Shanti Cooper Trones, dead in the bathroom. She was 39 years old. Dave claimed he'd found her in the bathtub, that she must have slipped and fallen, that he'd pulled her out and tried to revive her. But the scene didn't match his story. Not at all. The bathtub was completely dry. There was no water on the floor, no signs that anyone had been in that tub at all. And Shanti's body was dry too, despite Dave claiming he'd just pulled her from water. Her injuries were severe. She had a busted lip, a bloodied nose, a black eye, bruising around her chin and neck. Her skull was cracked. These weren't injuries from slipping in a bathtub. These were injuries from violence, from being beaten, from being strangled. The medical examiner would later confirm what the detective suspected. Shanti Coopertrons died from blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. This was murder. Dave Trond agreed to go to the Orlando Police Department headquarters. He went voluntarily without a lawyer. He seemed cooperative, willing to help with the investigation. Detectives Teresa Sprague and Barbara Sharp led the interrogation. It lasted 14 hours. 14 long hours of questions, of inconsistencies, of a story that didn't add up. Dave told them he'd last seen Shanti that morning around 7 a.m., then again at 9 a.m. He said he'd gone out to walk the dogs, came back, heard water running in the bathroom, and found her collapsed in the tub. But investigators had already found blood on Shanti's bed. They suspected she'd been killed in the bedroom, not the bathroom. They believed Dave had tried to stage the scene, tried to make it look like an accident. Detective Sprague confronted him. "I told you she was murdered." "Murdered. Someone took her life from her, and there's nothing. You can't even fake it. That's how much you could give a sit." Dave maintained his innocence. He suggested that maybe someone broke into the apartment, attacked Shanti while he was out. He pointed out that her expensive engagement ring, a $15,000 diamond, was missing. Maybe it was a robbery, but nothing else was missing. Not her diamond earrings, visible and valuable. Not cash that was sitting in plain view, just the engagement ring. And Dave's behavior troubled the detectives. For someone who just lost his wife, he showed remarkably little emotion. No tears. No real grief. At times during the interrogation, he even nodded off, falling asleep in the interview room. They couldn't charge him yet. They didn't have enough evidence. So after those 14 hours, they had to let him go. But they never stopped investigating. Over the next 4 months, detectives methodically built their case. They interviewed Shanti's friends and family. Everyone painted the same picture. A woman who'd been deceived, who'd given everything to a man who'd given her nothing but lies in return. They learned about Dave's secret life, his visits to the bathhouse. They learned about the financial problems, about how Shanti had paid for everything. They learned about the fights over the house, over money, over the reality show. They found Shanti's journals, where she'd written about her unhappiness, her frustration, feeling neglected and ignored by her husband. They discovered that Dave stood to inherit close to $1 million if he wasn't charged with Shanti's murder. Between her life insurance and her business assets, he had a clear financial motive. The original defense attorneys Dave had hired made a stunning discovery: bloody sheets from the bedroom where investigators believed Shanti had been killed. There was also a green cord that could have been the murder weapon, though no DNA was found on it. These items raised serious questions about whether Dave's lawyers were helping him or helping him cover up evidence. And then in August 2018, investigators found the missing engagement ring. It was at Dave's mother's house. He'd hidden it there. He had clearly taken it off of her cold dead body, Detective Sharp said. On August 29, 2018, 4 months after Shanti's murder, a Florida grand jury indicted David Tron on first-degree murder charges. He was arrested at his mother's house and held without bail. The case should have gone to trial quickly, but life had other plans. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down the courts. Everything was delayed. Then Dave's lawyers argued he was incompetent to stand trial. They said he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia. For years the case sat in legal limbo while experts evaluated him. While Jackson grew up without his mother. While Shanti's family waited for justice. Finally, in 2023, a judge determined that David Trones was indeed competent to stand trial. The case could move forward. By this time, Jackson was no longer the 8-year-old boy who'd lost his mother. He was a teenager, 15 years old. He'd spent 5 years waiting for this moment. In October 2023, more than 5 years after Shanti's death, David Trones finally went on trial for her murder. The trial lasted 6 days. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. They called Keith Ory to the stand. He testified about that last meeting with Shanti and Dave, about how tense she'd been, how upset she'd seemed. He said the filming was supposed to start in May 2018, just weeks after Shanti's death. The prosecution's theory was clear. Dave had become enraged when Shanti refused to go along with the reality show plan. In his mind, that show was supposed to save them, supposed to fix the disaster he'd created. When she walked away from that meeting angry, when she made it clear she was done, he snapped. They presented forensic evidence showing Shanti had been killed in the bedroom. Blood evidence on the bed. Signs that Dave had tried to clean up the scene, wiping down the bed rail, trying to wash away the blood. The shower in the bathroom was bone dry, proof that his story about finding her in the tub was a lie. The medical examiner testified about Shanti's injuries, the blunt force trauma to her head, the strangulation, the suffering she must have endured in those final moments. He chose to finish her off by strangling her. Detective Sprague told the jury, watching her suffer for however long, many minutes. Probably. The defense didn't call any witnesses. They argued that investigators had tunnel vision, that they'd focused on Dave from the beginning and ignored other possibilities. They suggested an intruder could have been responsible. They claimed the missing engagement ring had never actually been missing, that investigators had simply overlooked it during their initial search. But the jury didn't buy it. After 6 days of testimony, they deliberated and reached their verdict. On October 18th, 2023, David Truns was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Shanti Cooper Truns. Before sentencing, Shanti's family had the opportunity to address the court, to tell the judge, the jury, the world what they'd lost. What Dave had taken from them. Jackson, now 15 years old, stood before the court, the little boy who'd been 8 when his mother was murdered. The boy who'd spent 5 years waiting for this moment. Early 2018, she was taken from me and my family, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. It's like a hole in my heart that I can't fill or fix. She didn't die peacefully. She did not deserve anything that happened to her that night. My family and I have been waiting for about 5 years for justice. I miss her so much. He called his mother the best person I ever knew. And you could hear in his words the little boy he'd been, the teenager he'd become, the man he would grow into, all of them grieving the woman who should have been there to watch it all. Jim Cooper, Shanti's ex-husband, spoke about the impact on their son, about trying to shield Jackson from the worst of it, about helping him process something no child should ever have to face. Shanti's friends spoke, her family spoke, each one painting a picture of the vibrant, intelligent, loving woman they'd known, the devoted mother, the successful businesswoman, the loyal friend, the person who deserved so much better than what she got. Detective Barbara Sharp summed it up. She's in her own home, and she's with a man who is supposed to protect her, who's supposed to care for her, who's supposed to love her, and she certainly didn't deserve the brutality that she suffered. The judge sentenced David Truns to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 55 years old, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. After the conviction, custody of Jackson officially went to his father, Jim, though Jim had essentially been raising Jackson alone since Shanti's death 5 years earlier. There was a legal battle over Shanti's remains. Eventually, it was decided that her body would be cremated, and her ashes would be given to Jackson. Jim and Jackson have tried to move forward. They're close, more like friends than father and son, people say. Jim makes sure Jackson has good memories to balance out the horrible ones. Surprise trips to Key West, days at comic conventions, beach outings, movie night, just the everyday moments that make life worth living. They have a dog named Georgia Kane, who Jim calls his second child. The three of them, Jim, Jackson, and Georgia, are a family healing together, supporting each other, carrying Shanti's memory forward. Jackson keeps his mother's ashes. That woman who loved him more than anything in the world, who worked so hard to provide for him, who deserved to see him grow up, graduate high school, go to college, get married, have children of his own. All the moments she'll never get to see. And what about that house? The dream house that turned into a nightmare. The gargoyle-adorned Victorian mansion that Shanti poured $250,000 into. The house that was supposed to be featured on TV, that was supposed to save them, that became the focal point of so much pain. It stands empty now, most likely, a monument to broken dreams and terrible secrets. To the danger of believing in someone who doesn't deserve your trust. To the cost of chasing an image instead of accepting reality. Keith Ory, the contractor, said something haunting when he looked back on this case. Former prosecutor Ryan Vesio asked him, "Is it possible that without this house, Shanti might still be alive?" "I think that's completely true," Ory responded. That house consumed everything. First, Dave's obsession with it, his need to make it perfect, his vision that kept expanding beyond what was reasonable or safe. Then Shanti's money, her resources, her financial security, then her marriage, her peace of mind, her happiness, and finally, her life itself. All for a house, a building, 4 walls and a roof. Something that should have been a home became a tomb instead. When we look back at this story with the clarity of hindsight, we can see the warning signs that were there all along. The red flags that, had they been heeded, might have changed everything. Dave paid cash for a $600,000 house, but didn't put Shanti's name on the deed, even as they planned their future together. That's a red flag. He claimed to have millions in inheritance, but somehow Shanti ended up paying for everything. Their wedding, their bills, the renovation. That's a red flag. The renovation costs spiraled wildly out of control, eating up more and more money, yet he kept pushing forward instead of stopping and reassessing. That's a red flag. They went from sleeping in the same bed to sleeping in separate parts of the property. Physical distance in a marriage often reflects emotional distance. That's a red flag. Shanti's friends were worried. They actively distrusted Dave. When someone's friends all have a bad feeling about their partner, that's worth paying attention to. That's a red flag. Shanti was keeping journals about feeling neglected and ignored. When someone feels they need to document their unhappiness, when they're processing their relationship on paper instead of in open conversation, that marriage is in trouble. That's a red flag. And here's maybe the biggest one. Dave's entire life was built on lies. The inheritance that didn't exist. Wealth that was fake. The secret visits to the bathhouse. When someone's whole identity is a facade. When you realize the person you married isn't who they claim to be. You're not in a relationship, you're living with a stranger. That's a red flag. But here's the thing about red flags. They're only useful if you're able to see them. And more importantly, if you're able to get away safely once you see them. And sometimes by the time you realize how much danger you're in, it's already too late. Dave Tronas built his entire relationship with Shanti on lies. The inheritance. The financial security. The image of stability. None of it was real. But maybe the biggest lie was the one he told himself. That the house was the answer. That if he could just finish the renovation, just make it perfect, just get on that TV show, everything would be okay. His marriage would be saved. Shanti wouldn't leave him. The financial disaster would be fixed. The truth wouldn't matter anymore. It's a dangerous thing when someone becomes so obsessed with a project, an idea, a vision, that they lose sight of reality. When they convince themselves that one big break, one success, one moment of glory will solve all their problems. Because when that solution fails, when the TV show falls through, when the wife says no, when reality comes crashing in, what then? For Dave Tronas, the answer was violence. When his house of cards started collapsing, when Shanti walked out of that meeting clearly done with the whole thing, he couldn't accept it. He couldn't let her go. He couldn't face the truth of what he'd done, the disaster he'd created, the lies he'd told. So he took away her choice. He took away her voice. He took away her life. And in doing so, he destroyed not just Shanti but Jackson's childhood, Jim's co-parent, the friends who loved her, the family who cherished her, all the lives she touched, all the people who needed her. Gone, because one man couldn't accept that his lies had caught up with him. It would be easy to let this story end with the violence, with the tragedy, with the senseless waste of it all. But that wouldn't be fair to Shanti. That wouldn't honor who she really was. So let's remember her differently. Not as a victim, though, she certainly was that, but as a person. A full, complex, beautiful human being who lived and loved and built a life that mattered. Shanti was a devoted mother who made her son her world. Jackson was her pride and joy, her reason for everything. She worked hard to provide for him, to give him stability and love and a good life. She was a successful businesswoman who built a lucrative financial software company from scratch. She was intelligent, capable, independent. She didn't need someone to take care of her financially. She could take care of herself. She was a loyal friend. The kind of person who showed up for the people she loved, who was supportive and present and genuine. She was someone who believed in second chances, who was willing to open her heart after a difficult divorce and try love again. That takes courage. That takes hope. That takes faith in the possibility of happiness. She was someone who invested in dreams. Literally. She put $250,000 into a house because she believed it could become a home, because she wanted to build something beautiful, because she had vision and commitment and the willingness to sacrifice for what she thought would benefit her family. Yes, some of those choices didn't work out. Yes, she trusted someone who didn't deserve it. Yes, she stayed longer than she should have. But those aren't character flaws. Those are human vulnerabilities that we all share. The capacity to hope, to believe, to want things to work out. Shanti Cooper Trones was 39 years old when she died. That's too young. She had so much life left to live, so many more memories to make with Jackson, so many more successes to achieve in her business, so many more years of friendship to share with the people who loved her. Dave Trones took all of that away, but he couldn't take away who she was. He couldn't erase the impact she had on people's lives. He couldn't undo the love she gave her son, the success she built, the friendship she nurtured. Those remain. Those matter. Those are her legacy. And now we come to the part where this story connects to you, listening in the quiet darkness, perhaps drifting off to sleep, If you take anything from Shanti's story, let it be this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, when your friends are worried, when you find yourself making excuses for someone's behavior, when you're paying attention to red flags but talking yourself out of acting on them, let us to that voice inside you that knows something isn't right. Love shouldn't cost you your peace of mind. A relationship shouldn't drain you financially, emotionally, spiritually. A partner shouldn't make you feel neglected, ignored, or alone even when you're in the same house. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're afraid, where you're thinking about leaving but worried about what might happen, reach out, tell someone. Make a plan. There are resources, hotlines, organizations dedicated to helping people get out of dangerous situations safely. Because Shanti deserved better. She deserved to leave safely when she was done. To walk away from that disaster of a house and that disaster of a marriage and build a new life for herself and Jackson. She deserved to grow old, to watch her son become a man, to find real love with someone who would cherish her the way she deserved to be cherished. She deserved to live. The house on East Copeland Drive in Orlando's Delaney Park neighborhood stands today as a reminder of dreams that turn dark, of trust misplaced, of the terrible price one woman paid for believing in someone who didn't deserve her belief. But somewhere in Orlando, Jackson Cooper is living his life, going to school, spending time with his father, playing with Georgia the dog, making memories that his mother would have loved to be part of. He carries her with him in his heart, in his memories, in the ashes he keeps, in the person he's becoming. That's the real ending to this story. Not the violence, not the trial, not the life sentence, but life itself, continuing on. Shanti lives on in her son, in the people who remember her, in the impact she had on this world during her too short time here. Rest easy, Shanti Cooper. You deserved so much better, but you also gave so much more than you ever received, and that matters. That will always matter. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we travel to the quiet corners of East Texas, where a story unfolds that reminds us how darkness can hide behind the most ordinary facades. This is the story of Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr., a young father whose life was cut short on a cold February morning in 2015. Ernest Ibarra came into this world on Christmas Day, 1985 in Mount Pleasant, Texas. His mother would later remember that he weighed exactly 7 pounds, 5 ounces. The family called him Ernie. As a child, he was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of boy who preferred the company of books to the chaos of the playground. His sister Abigail would remember him as a bookworm, always with his nose buried in some tome or another. But as Ernie grew, his interest shifted from the pages of novels to the glow of computer screens. By high school, technology had captured his imagination completely. He became an avid gamer, spending hours in digital worlds, and he developed a knack for computer repair. He was the person friends called when their laptops refused to start or when mysterious error messages appeared. Ernie had that particular gift of understanding how machines think. In 2008, when Ernie was 22 years old, he walked into a local tattoo shop in Mount Pleasant. It was an ordinary day, the kind that passes without notice, but that day would change the trajectory of his life. There, among the buzz of tattoo guns and the smell of antiseptic, he met Samantha Bulford. Samantha was different from anyone Ernie had known before. She had a presence, a way of drawing attention to herself. At 19, she'd already become a mother to twins, children from a high school relationship that hadn't lasted. But Samantha didn't let that slow her down. She had dreams, big dreams. Dreams of being someone important, someone famous. The connection between Ernie and Samantha was immediate. To those who knew them in those early days, they seemed like soulmates. They moved in together, building a life in the modest corners of Titus County. And in 2011, Samantha discovered she was pregnant. When the ultrasound revealed twins, Samantha must have experienced a strange sense of deja vu. She was about to become a mother of 4. Life became more complicated. Ernie took on the role of provider with quiet determination. He worked at a company called D-Bat, running machines that manufactured baseball bats. The work was steady, methodical, but one job wasn't enough to support a family of 6. So Ernie took on a second position, working nights at Little Caesar's Pizza. He'd come home smelling of wood shavings and pepperoni, exhausted but determined. In 2013, a 5th child arrived. Samantha was 24 years old, and Ernie was 27. They now had a family of 7 to care for. The financial pressure was immense. Every month brought new struggles, new calculations of what they could afford and what would have to wait. It was around this time that Samantha had an idea. YouTube was growing, becoming a place where ordinary people could build audiences, maybe even make money. She started her own channel, filming videos in their home, talking about her life as a young mother of 5. She discussed her struggles, her passions, her daily routines. The views trickled in slowly at first, but Samantha saw potential. As her channel grew, something shifted in Samantha. According to Ernie's sister Abigail, Samantha began to believe her YouTube career was going somewhere. She started paying less attention to the children, treating her channel like a job that superseded everything else. Ernie would come home after long shifts at his 2 jobs to find the house in disarray, the children needing care. Arguments became frequent. But there were other tensions too. Ernie had his own escape, his own world, where he could forget the mounting pressure. He spent hours gaming online, losing himself in virtual adventures. At some point, his online avatar even married another player's character. To Samantha, this felt like a betrayal, a sign that Ernie had checked out of their real life together. To mend the fractures in their relationship, Ernie agreed to make their commitment official. In 2014, they married. Perhaps they hoped that the ceremony would reset something, would bring them back to those early days in the tattoo shop, when everything seemed possible. But marriage didn't solve their problems. The arguments continued. The financial stress intensified. And beneath the surface of their struggles, something darker was taking root in Samantha's mind. The hospital was quiet on the afternoon of February 14th, 2015, Valentine's Day. Samantha had come to visit a friend named Charlotte Kemp, who'd just given birth. Hospital maternity wards have a particular atmosphere full of new beginnings and exhausted joy. But that day, they would become the birthplace of something terrible. In the parking lot during a smoke break, Samantha met a man named Jonathan Kyle Sanford. Sanford was 25 years old and had recently been released from prison. He and Samantha connected through their mutual friend Charlotte. In those casual conversations, Samantha began to talk about her life, about her husband. She told Sanford that Ernie was abusive, that she lived in fear. Sanford listened. And then he said something that would set a chain of events in motion. He told Samantha not to worry. He could take Ernie out of the picture. Over the next few days, Sanford recruited help. He brought in his brother-in-law, Jose Antonio Ponces, and a friend named Octavius Lamar Rhymes, who was 28. The 3 men began to formulate a plan. Their first idea was relatively simple. They would plant methamphetamine in Ernie's truck, and then tip off the police. Ernie would be arrested, removed from Samantha's life without any direct violence. On the night of February 19th, Samantha climbed into her vehicle with her children in the back gate. Sanford, Rhymes, and Ponce joined them. They drove to Mount Vernon to meet Rhymes's cousin, who sold them methamphetamine. As they made their way back toward Pittsburgh, the conversation took a dark turn. Setting someone up for a drug arrest is complicated. There are too many variables, too many ways it could go wrong. Someone suggested a simpler solution. Why not just kill Ernie? It would be easier, cleaner, more permanent. The men smoked the methamphetamine they'd purchased. The drug amplified everything, sharpening their worst impulses while dulling any moral hesitation they might have felt. By the time they arrived at Octavius Rhymes' house on Elm Street in Pittsburgh, the decision had been made. Ernie Ibarra would die that night. Jose Ponce's girlfriend was there when they arrived, and Ponce cooked enchiladas while they waited for the right moment. The mundane normalcy of that scene, cooking dinner while planning a murder, speaks to how detached from reality they'd become. As the night deepened and the hour approached 2 in the morning, Sanford, Ponce, and Rhymes prepared themselves. They stole gloves from Walmart, 3 pairs that they would wear to avoid leaving fingerprints. They armed themselves with a pistol and a knife, and then they drove to the Ibarra home on County Road 2630 in the southwest part of Titus County, Texas. Samantha was already there, of course. She knew they were coming. This was her home, her husband, her plan. February 20th, 2015 began in the coldest hours before dawn. The temperature had dropped, and a bitter chill settled over Titus County. In their bedroom, Ernie and Samantha were asleep. Ernie had worked late, as usual, and exhaustion had pulled him under quickly. The sound of the front door breaking was what woke Samantha, or at least that's what she would later claim. In truth, she'd been waiting for it, listening for it. 3 figures dressed in black moved through the house with purpose. They knew exactly where to go, exactly what they were there to do. One of them grabbed Samantha, pulling her from the bed. She didn't scream, not yet. She couldn't risk waking Ernie too soon, before they had control of the situation. They tied her up, binding her hands behind her back, taping her ankles together, placing a gag in her mouth. One of them held a knife to her throat. She told the men to make it look real, to make her appear like a victim. And so they did, slapping her across the face hard enough to leave a mark. Ernie woke to chaos. Before he could fully understand what was happening, before he could react or fight back, they were on him. The pistol came down across his face once, twice, again and again. They beat him with their fists, pistol whipped him until blood ran down his face. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Ernie begged them. He begged for his life. He begged them not to hurt his family, not to hurt his children who were sleeping somewhere in the house. The men dragged Ernie down the stairs. His blood left traces, but strangely, investigators would later note that there wasn't as much blood as there should have been in the bedroom. The scene had been staged, controlled. They bound Ernie with tape, wrapping it around his hands and his mouth. And then they took him. They dragged Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr. out of his own home, out into the cold February darkness, and shoved him into Samantha's vehicle, a Chevy Equinox. The engine started, and the SUV pulled away from the house, its taillights disappearing into the night. Inside the house, Samantha waited. She needed to time this perfectly. Wait too long, and Ernie might be saved. Call too soon, and the plan might unravel. She remained tied up, alone in the house, with her 5 sleeping children, counting the minutes. At some point after 2 in the morning, Samantha's mother, Rosie Wolford, was pulled from sleep by her ringing phone. When she answered, she heard her daughter's voice, frantic and terrified. There had been intruders, Samantha said. They'd kidnapped Ernie. She was tied up. She needed help. Rosie's world tilted. She tried to understand what her daughter was saying through the panic and the crying. Finally, she managed to hear Samantha say, "I'm tied up." The words sent ice through Rosie's veins. She'd never been so scared in her life. Rosie called her sister, Ginger Kesterson, who lived nearby. Ginger rushed to the house and found Samantha upstairs, bound and gagged just as she'd described. The front door was shattered, lying in pieces. There were signs of a struggle, blood stains, a lock of hair near the door. Deputies from the Titus County Sheriff's Department arrived within minutes of the 911 call. Sheriff Tim Ingram himself responded, understanding immediately that this was a race against time. A man had been kidnapped from his home. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding him alive. The deputies found Samantha where Ginger had left her, still tied up. They cut her free and began asking questions. Samantha told them a story about masked intruders dressed all in black. She said they'd held a knife to her throat, while others dragged Ernie downstairs and beat him. The men had taken him, she said, and she had no idea who they were or why they'd come. But as the deputies interviewed Samantha, small inconsistencies began to emerge. She called her mother before calling 911, which struck some as odd, despite the reported violence of the attack. There wasn't enough blood in the bedroom. Valuables hadn't been taken. The scene felt staged, performative. As the interview continued, Samantha's story began to shift. She mentioned that she'd been at the hospital recently, visiting a friend. While there, she'd encountered a man she knew as Johnny Rebel. She'd complained to him about Ernie being abusive. and Johnny had seemed upset about it. Maybe, she suggested, Johnny Rebel had something to do with this. The investigators moved quickly. Time was critical. If Ernie Ibarra was still alive, they needed to find him before it was too late. They tracked down Johnny Rebel, who turned out to be Jonathan Kyle Sanford. They found him at the Titus County Regional Medical Center, along with Jose Ponce. The two men had come to the hospital for breakfast, of all things, as if they could simply walk back into normal life after what they'd done. Under interrogation, Sanford began to talk. He was already a convicted felon, and he knew how these things worked. He understood that cooperation might mean a better deal. And so he told the investigators everything. He described meeting Samantha on Valentine's Day, how she'd complained about her husband's alleged abuse. He explained the plan to plant drugs in Ernie's truck, and how that plan had evolved into something much darker. He admitted that he, Ponce, and Rhymes had gone to the Ibarra home in the early morning hours of February 20th. He described the beating, the kidnapping, the drive through Pittsburgh, and then Sanford told them something that made the investigators' blood run cold. He led them to the body. They drove southeast of the Lone Star Steel Mill, into Camp County. The area was remote, covered in thick undergrowth and briars. At the edge of a bayou, where winter mist was beginning to turn to cold rain, they found Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr. He was half naked, his body tangled in the thorny vegetation where he'd fallen. He'd been shot once in the back of the head. The medical examiner would later confirm that this single gunshot was the cause of death, though Ernie had also been severely beaten and pistol-whipped. Jose Ponce had pulled the trigger, Sanford said. After all the beating and taunting, after dragging Ernie through the woods, Ponce had executed him. Detective Wayne Miner, who photographed the crime scene, would later reflect on their timing. If it hadn't come together so fast, we might not have closed the case, he said. Rain set in the next day, and Lake of the Pines rose 4 feet over the place where they'd found Ernie's body. The water level wouldn't go down for months. If they'd been even a day slower, crucial evidence might have been washed away forever. Back at the sheriff's office, Samantha Volford spent most of that Saturday in an interrogation room. Hour after hour, the investigators pressed her on inconsistencies in her story. They had the testimony from Sanford and Ponce. They were tracking down Octavius Rhymes, who would be arrested 4 days later in a Brookshire's grocery parking lot with methamphetamine and cash in his pockets. But most damning were the text messages. While the investigation was underway in those early morning hours, while deputies were using cell phone towers to track Ernie's location, Samantha had been texting with the killers. From Samantha's phone to Rhymes' phone came a message: "Kill Ernie's phone, shut that down." A couple of hours later, when investigators found a location for Ernie's cell phone, another text arrived. "Ditch phone. Move." Samantha tried to maintain her story, tried to insist she was a victim, but the evidence was overwhelming. The vehicle used in the kidnapping was her own Chevy Equinox. She'd been communicating with the killers throughout the night. She'd known exactly who these men were, despite her initial claims that they were masked strangers. The investigation revealed something else too. On the day before the murder, before meeting at the hospital, Sanford and Rhymes had accompanied Volford to Walmart. They'd removed the car seats from her vehicle, creating space for what was to come. They'd stolen the gloves they would wear during the murder. Every step had been planned, choreographed. Detective Chris Bragg would later comment on the tragedy of timing. If his wife had come clean when the first officers arrived, he might still be alive, he said. While Samantha was spinning her tale of masked intruders, while deputies were searching for unknown suspects, Ernie was being driven through Pittsburgh by his kidnappers. Within an hour of the 911 call, he was dead in the undergrowth. At the edge of Camp County, the truth might have saved him, but the truth was the last thing Samantha wanted to reveal. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they do turn. In April 2016, both Jonathan Sanford and Jose Ponce pleaded guilty to aggravated kidnapping and murder. Each received 50 years in prison, the sentences to run concurrently. They wouldn't be eligible for parole until they'd served at least half of their time. Octavius Lamar Rhymes chose to go to trial. In Titus County, he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 23 years. Then in Camp County, he stood trial for murder and received 75 additional years to be served consecutively on top of his kidnapping sentence. Rhymes's total sentence came to 98 years behind bars. Detective Wayne Miner, who'd worked for weeks putting together a timeline and watching hours of security camera footage from Walmart and the hospital, reflected on the perpetrators. They were all such unremarkable people, he said. There was nothing exceptional about any of them, nothing that would make them stand out in a crowd. Samantha Wolford was the catalyst, he said, fusing them together in a crazed explosion of violence. Samantha herself was first tried in Titus County for her role in the aggravated kidnapping. The jury found her guilty and sentenced her to 50 years in prison. But that wasn't the end of her legal troubles. In September 2017, more than 2 years after Ernie's death, Samantha stood trial in Camp County for murder. The trial began on September 11th, with jury selection. Over the following days, prosecutors laid out their case. They presented Sanford's testimony, detailing how Samantha had initiated the plan and coordinated the killing. They showed the jury the text messages, proving that Samantha had been in communication with the killers throughout the night, even instructing them to destroy evidence while pretending to be a victim. An investigator testified about the crime scene, describing how it had been purposefully staged. The lack of blood in the bedroom where Ernie should have been beaten, the broken door that seemed more theatrical than functional, the placement of Samantha's restraints, carefully positioned to support her story. Ballistics experts testified that the shell casing found near Ernie's body matched the gun discovered at Rhymes' residence. Cell phone records contradicted Samantha's claims that she didn't know the men. The evidence was overwhelming. Layer upon layer of proof that this had been no random home invasion, but a carefully orchestrated murder. The district attorney made his closing argument, imploring the jury to see through Samantha's deception. She hadn't been a victim that night. She'd been the architect of her husband's death, the person who'd set everything in motion. On September 14, 2017, the Camp County jury returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. They sentenced Samantha Nicole Wolford to 99 years in prison. Judge Robert Rolston ordered that this sentence be served consecutively with her previous 50-year sentence for kidnapping. In total, Samantha faced 149 years behind bars. Sheriff Tim Ingram issued a statement, calling the conviction a milestone marking our commitment to the surviving family members of Ernie Ibarra in our efforts to seek justice for Ernie's kidnapping and murder. Today, Samantha Nicole Wolford is incarcerated at the Carroll Young Complex in Dickinson, Texas. According to Texas Department of Criminal Justice records, her maximum sentence date extends to the year 2164. She won't be eligible for parole until 2040, when she'll be in her 50s. Her YouTube channel still exists, frozen in time, the last video uploaded in 2014, before everything fell apart. Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr. never got to see his children grow up. He was 29 years old when he died, killed on a cold February morning by people his wife had recruited. His mother, Rhonda Floyd, remembers the boy born on Christmas Day, 7 pounds 5 ounces. His sister Abigail remembers the bookworm who became a computer enthusiast, the brother who worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide for his family. The 5 children Ernie and Samantha had together, Jareth, Caden, and Keely Wolford among them, lost both parents that night, their father to violence, their mother to prison. They'll grow up knowing the story, knowing what happened and why. Looking back at the case, investigators struggled to understand how it had spiraled so completely out of control. The relationship between Ernie and Samantha had been troubled. Certainly, there were allegations of abuse on both sides. Restraining orders filed and violated. The financial pressure of raising 5 children on low-wage jobs was immense. The couple argued about Samantha's YouTube aspirations and Ernie's gaming habits. These were real problems, the kind many couples face. But somewhere along the way, Samantha convinced herself that murder was the solution. Or perhaps she'd always had that capacity for violence, and the circumstances simply provided an opportunity. We'll never fully know what darkness lived in her heart, what twisted logic led her to orchestrate her husband's killing. What we do know is that on February 19, 2015, Samantha Wolford made a choice. She could have sought a divorce. She could have worked on repairing her marriage. She could have reached out for help, for counseling, for any of the resources available to struggling families. Instead, she chose to recruit 3 men, to plant the seeds of murder, to stage a home invasion while her children slept upstairs. The case shows how quickly plans can escalate, how methamphetamine and bad intentions can combine into something monstrous. The original plan to plant drugs in Ernie's truck was terrible enough, but at least it wouldn't have ended in death. But somewhere in that car on the way back from buying meth, the decision was made to go further. Murder would be easier, they decided. More permanent. Ernie begged for his life. As they beat him, he pleaded with them not to hurt his family. According to Sanford's testimony, Ernie knew he was going to die. He must have wondered why this was happening, what he'd done to deserve such a fate. He couldn't have known that his own wife had orchestrated it all, that she'd been texting with his killers while pretending to be tied up and helpless. The location where they killed him was carefully chosen, southeast of the Lone Star Steel Mill in remote Camp County, where the undergrowth was thick and the bayou water could hide evidence. They dragged him into the woods, left him half naked among the briars, and Jose Ponce put a bullet in the back of his head. Then they drove away, leaving Ernie's body to the cold and the mist. When Sanford and Ponce showed up at the hospital for breakfast that morning, did they think they'd gotten away with it? Did they believe Samantha's staged crime scene would hold up to scrutiny? The arrogance of returning to a normal routine just hours after committing murder speaks to a fundamental disconnection from reality. But the investigators didn't believe Samantha's story. Too many pieces didn't fit. Too many details were off. And when they pressed her, when they showed her the evidence mounting against her, Samantha's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. The text messages were perhaps the most damning evidence. While Samantha was supposedly tied up and terrified, she was instructing the killers to destroy Ernie's phone so police couldn't track it. She was monitoring the investigation in real time. Trying to help the men avoid capture, a real victim wouldn't have known what the police were doing. A real victim wouldn't have been texting with her husband's killers. But Samantha wasn't a victim. She was the mastermind. The murder of Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr. reminds us that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. The person who shares your bed, who raises children with you, who knows all your vulnerabilities. That person can also be the architect of your destruction. Ernie worked hard. He tried to be a good father. He had his flaws, certainly. His gaming obsession and whatever problems existed in his marriage. But he didn't deserve to be beaten and executed in a cold Texas bayou. No one deserves that. Samantha Wolford wanted to be famous. She dreamed of YouTube stardom, of being someone important. In the end, she got her wish, though not in the way she'd hoped. Her name is now attached to a notorious murder case, featured in true crime documentaries and articles. She's famous, but for all the wrong reasons. The case is closed now. Trials are over. The sentences have been handed down. 4 people are in prison for their roles in Ernie's death. And they'll be there for decades to come. But for the family members left behind, for Ernie's mother and sister, for his 5 children, the pain continues. They carry the weight of that February morning, the knowledge of how it happened and why. In the quiet of East Texas, life goes on. The house on County Road 2630 has new occupants now. The hospital where Samantha met Sanford continues to deliver babies, continues to be a place of new beginnings. The bayou where Ernie died has reclaimed that spot. Water and vegetation covering the ground where his body fell. But the story remains. A cautionary tale about ambition and resentment. About how a failing marriage can become a death sentence when darkness takes hold. It's a reminder to pay attention to the warning signs, to take threats seriously, to understand that sometimes the person sleeping next to you is capable of unthinkable things. Ernest Lee Ibarra Jr. was born on Christmas Day, 1985. He died on February 20th, 2015, at the age of 29. He was a father, a brother, a son. He loved computers and gaming. He worked hard to provide for his family, and on a cold morning in Texas, he was taken from this world by people who should have cared about him, led by the woman who'd promised to love him. Rest easy, Ernie. Your story has been told. Justice, imperfect as it may be, has been served. And somewhere out there, 5 children carry your memory forward, hoping to find peace with a past they never asked for. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. This is the story of Sarah Everard. a story that shook an entire nation. It's about trust betrayed, systems that failed, and a family forever changed. Tonight we remember her not just as a victim, but as the vibrant person she was. Sarah Everard was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her life mattered. Sarah Everard was born on June 14, 1987, in Surrey, England, the youngest of 3 children to Jeremy and Sue Everard. From the very beginning, Sarah was described by those who knew her as bright, beautiful, and kind. Her family was close-knit, the kind that gathered for Sunday dinners and celebrated each other's achievements with genuine joy. Growing up in York, Sarah attended Fulford School, where she was known not just for her academic abilities, but for her warmth toward others. She had a gift for making people feel seen, feel heard. Friends would later say that Sarah was the type of person who would drop everything if you needed her, no matter the hour, no matter the circumstance. In 2005, Sarah left York for Durham University, where she would study human geography at St. Cuthbert's Society. Durham suited her, the medieval architecture, the winding cobblestone streets, the riverware cutting through the city like a silver ribbon. She thrived there, both academically and socially. At Durham, Sarah formed friendships that would last a lifetime. She was part of a large, tight-knit circle of friends. They attended rugby matches together on Sunday mornings at Maiden Castle. They studied late into the night, fueled by coffee and determination. They went to music festivals, including Glastonbury, multiple times. Sarah loved live music, loved the energy of a crowd, the way a song could transport you somewhere else entirely. One of her closest friends from those Durham years was Rose Wallard. Rose would later tell reporters that Sarah was an exceptional friend, the kind who made you feel like you were the most important person in the world when you were talking to her. Sarah had recently been there for Rose after her mother passed away, calling every single day to check in, to offer comfort, to simply listen. Sarah graduated from Durham in 2008 with her degree in geography. Like so many young graduates, she had dreams of building a life, a career, of discovering what adulthood held for her. She traveled for a while after graduation, soaking in different cultures, different landscapes, different perspectives. Eventually, Sarah made her way to London. She settled in Brixton Hill in South London, sharing a flat in an area popular with young professionals. Brixton was vibrant, diverse, alive with energy, markets spilling onto sidewalks, the scent of Caribbean food mixing with the sound of reggae music, street art adorning brick walls. Sarah built a successful career in marketing. She worked as a marketing executive for a digital media agency, and by early 2021, she had just been promoted. She was excited about her new role as a senior marketing account manager. It was the kind of milestone that felt like validation, like everything was falling into place. At 33, Sarah's life was full of possibility. She had a loving boyfriend, Josh Loth, who worked just a few streets away from her in Brixton. They had plans, the kind of plans couples make when they're building a future together. Her father, Jeremy, would later say that Sarah had been saving to buy a house, that she was looking forward to marriage, to children. We were looking forward to having grandchildren, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of what would never be. Sarah's mother, Susan, described her daughter as my precious little girl, a talented dancer who lit up every room she entered. Her elder sister, Katie, called her the very best person, with so many people who love and cherish her. A former colleague, Peter McCormick, shared a photo of them together during an 80s-themed night out, writing, "You couldn't have met a nicer, sweeter, funnier, more beautiful person. Crap at karaoke. Brilliant at everything else." This was Sarah Everard, a woman with a full life, with plans, with people who loved her deeply. A woman who should have had decades ahead of her. But on March 3rd, 2021, everything changed. March 3rd, 2021 was a Wednesday. London was still in the grip of COVID-19 restrictions. The city felt different than it had before the pandemic. Quieter, more cautious. People were following rules, staying home when they could, wearing masks, keeping distance. That evening, Sarah had gone to visit a friend who lived on Lethwaite Road near Clapham Junction in South London. It was a tree-lined street in a nice area, the kind of neighborhood with multi-million-pound homes at the edge of Clapham Common. Sarah had made this journey before. Many times. It was familiar, routine. She left her friend's house around 9 o'clock in the evening, stepping out through a back gate and beginning the walk home to Brixton Hill. It should have taken about 50 minutes on foot, a distance of roughly 2.5 miles. The route took her along the A205, also known as the South Circular Road, a major road that cuts across South London. At 9:13 p.m., Sarah called her boyfriend Josh. They talked for just over 14 minutes, the kind of easy, comfortable conversation that couples have at the end of an ordinary day. They made plans to meet the next day. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Sarah was doing everything right. She was on a well-lit main road. She was on the phone with someone she loved. She was wearing bright clothing. She had her wits about her. In every practical sense, Sarah was being safe, following all the advice society gives women about how to protect themselves. At 9:28 p.m., doorbell camera footage captured Sarah walking along Pointers Road. She was walking with purpose, heading home. 4 minutes later, at 9:32 p.m., a passing police car's dash cam briefly captured her on the same road. And then, at approximately 9:34 p.m., Sarah Everard's life intersected with that of Wayne Couzens. A white Vauxhall Astra was parked on the pavement outside Pointers Court. The car's hazard lights were flashing. A man approached Sarah. He showed her a police warrant card. He told her she was being arrested, likely claiming she had breached COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. In that moment, Sarah probably felt a jolt of confusion, maybe even fear, but also the kind of compliance that comes from being approached by someone in authority. Wayne Couzens placed handcuffs on Sarah Everard's wrists. Plus, cameras captured 2 separate images that would later become crucial evidence. At 9:35 p.m., the first camera showed 2 figures standing beside the white Vauxhall Astra. At 9:38 p.m., another camera showed the car with both front doors open. By 9:38 p.m., Sarah was inside the vehicle, and with that, she disappeared. When Sarah didn't show up to meet Josh the next day, Thursday, March 4th, he grew concerned. It wasn't like her. Sarah was reliable, communicative, the kind of person who always let people know where she was. When he couldn't reach her, when her phone went to voicemail, when messages on WhatsApp weren't delivered, Josh reported her missing. The Metropolitan Police launched a missing person investigation. Almost immediately, they recognized something was wrong. Sarah's disappearance was completely out of character. Her family, still in York, was devastated. Her Aunt Jane told reporters, "We're devastated. It is so out of character for her. She has a very big circle of friends from Durham, where she was at university and down in London. It has been a real shock. We are all so worried." Sarah's uncle, Nick Everard, made a desperate plea, his voice breaking with emotion. "If someone is holding her against her will, I would plead with them just to be human and to let her come home. To let her talk to us. Give us a ring or text to let us know she is okay. These are desperate times for the family. The not knowing what has happened is agonizing." The family traveled 200 miles from Yorkshire to London to join the search efforts. They walked the route Sarah would have taken, hoping for any clue, any sign of what had happened to their daughter, their niece, their sister. The police investigation moved quickly. Dozens of officers from the Met Specialist Crime Command scoured through hours of CCTV footage from the route Sarah would have taken. They conducted door-to-door inquiries. The Marine Policing Unit searched ponds in Clapham Common. The disappearance quickly became national news. Sarah's face was everywhere, on missing person posters, on social media, on television news broadcasts. And then on March 9th, 6 days after Sarah vanished, the investigation took a shocking turn. Police arrested a suspect in Deal, Kent, a coastal town about 80 miles southeast of London. But this wasn't just any suspect. The man they arrested was a serving Metropolitan Police officer. Wayne Couzens, 48 years old, was taken into custody first on suspicion of kidnapping, and then the following day, on suspicion of murder. The nation recoiled in horror. A police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, the very person who should represent safety, had become the embodiment of danger. On March 10th, human remains were discovered in a densely wooded area near Ashford in Kent. The location was remote, isolated, hidden among the trees. After the remains were formally identified as Sarah's, Couzens was charged with her kidnapping and murder. Wayne Couzens was born in Dover, Kent, on December 20th, 1972. He grew up in the area, attending Castlemount School. After finishing his education, he worked as a mechanic in his family's garage. On the surface, his early life seemed unremarkable, but beneath that surface, warning signs had existed for decades. Later investigations would reveal a disturbing history. As early as his school days, former classmates reported concerning behavior. One recalled Cousins shooting someone with a revolver during their school years, describing how he seemed to get off on hurting people and showed no remorse, no conscience. In 1989, while working at the family garage, he reportedly viewed violent pornography. In 2002, there was an alleged sexual incident during his time with the Territorial Army. Despite these red flags, Cousins began a career in policing. In 2002, he joined the Kent Special Constabulary as a volunteer officer. In 2011, he became an officer with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary. And in September 2018, he transferred to the Metropolitan Police Service, one of the largest and most prominent police forces in the world. By February 2020, Cousins had moved to the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, where he worked as an armed officer patrolling diplomatic premises, including embassies. He was entrusted with a firearm. He was given the responsibility of protecting some of the most important sites in London. On the day he kidnapped Sarah, he had just finished a 12-hour shift at the U.S. Embassy. But throughout his police career, Cousins continued to offend. And repeatedly, those offenses were either not investigated properly or not reported at all. In 2015, Kent police failed to investigate an incident of indecent exposure linked to Cousins. On November 13, 2020, just months before Sarah's murder, Cousins stepped out of a woodland area in Deal completely naked and masturbated as a woman cycled past. She reported it, but nothing came of it. In February 2021, mere days before he would murder Sarah Everard, Cousins exposed himself to two female staff members at a McDonald's drive-thru in Kent. He pulled up to the serving window, naked from the waist down, one worker later said. He casually pulled up to the serving hatch having ordered his food, and I could clearly see that he was naked from below the waist. It was not the first time that he had done this when he came to McDonald's. But I was the only female member of staff to report it. I'm glad I took a stand and alerted the authorities because it was the right thing to do. But I never imagined that he would go on to murder a woman. Tragic. The whole thing has left me quite disturbed. A Metropolitan Police officer, Samantha Lee, was assigned to investigate this February incident. She went to the McDonald's on March 3rd, the same day Cousins kidnapped Sarah, but failed to properly investigate. Security footage apparently showed Cousins' registration number clearly visible, but Lee did not trace the vehicle. She would later be found guilty of gross misconduct and sacked from the force. Colleagues at the Metropolitan Police had nicknamed Cousins the rapist because of his inappropriate behavior around female officers. This nickname, this warning sign, somehow never triggered any formal investigation or action. Cousins had also demonstrated unusual behavior in other ways. In 2019, he and his wife purchased a small area of woodland in Ashford, Kent. This isolated patch of land would later become significant for reasons that are almost too horrific to contemplate. An inquiry led by Lady Elish Angelini would later conclude that Cousins should never have been a police officer. The inquiry found evidence of his preference for violent and extreme pornography dating back nearly 20 years. It found that he had allegedly committed a very serious sexual assault against a child, described as barely in her teens when he was in his early 20s. There were allegations he possessed indecent images of children. The inquiry identified at least 5 incidents that were never reported to police, and suggested there may be more victims who never came forward. 3 police forces, Kent Police, the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, and the Metropolitan Police, had all failed to properly vet him, failed to investigate allegations against him, failed to stop him, despite repeated red flags, despite allegations, despite warning signs that should have been impossible to ignore. Wayne Cousins was allowed to continue serving as a police officer, and on March 3, 2021, that catastrophic failure of systems and oversight cost Sarah Everard her life. Let's return to that Wednesday evening to 9:34 p.m. on Poinders Road. Wayne Cousins had rented the white Vauxhall Astra on February 28th, just days before. He had booked it using his personal details and bank card, leaving a clear paper trail. On March 2nd, he worked his shift at the U.S. Embassy from 7 p.m. until early morning on March 3rd. After his shift ended, he collected the rental car at 4:45 p.m. on March 3rd. What happened next was premeditated. Cousins was on a hunt. The prosecutor at his trial, Tom Little, would later state that Cousins was looking for a lone young woman. Sarah Everard was tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time. When Cousins showed Sarah his police warrant card and told her she was being arrested, she likely believed him. Why wouldn't she? He was a police officer. The warrant card was real. The handcuffs were real. In March 2021, London was still under strict COVID-19 lockdown rules, and police were actively enforcing those rules. Being stopped for a supposed breach wouldn't have seemed outlandish. Sarah got into the car. She complied, because that's what we're taught to do when confronted by police authority. Cousins drove the rental car, with Sarah handcuffed inside on a journey that took approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. He drove to Dover in Kent, covering about 80 miles. At around 11:38 p.m., he arrived at a pre-arranged location and transferred Sarah from the rental car to his own personal vehicle. A seat. What happened in those moments, those hours? Sarah must have been terrified. As the car drove farther and farther from London, as the city lights gave way to dark countryside, she would have known something was very wrong. Her mother, Susan, would later say in court, "I go through the terrible sequence of events. I wonder when she realized she was in mortal danger." At 2:31 a.m., having already transferred Sarah to his own car, Cummins stopped at a service station in Dover to buy drinks. Security cameras captured him. He was calm, methodical, just a man buying drinks in the middle of the night. He drove Sarah to a secluded rural area near the woodland he owned. That remote, isolated place where no one would hear, where no one would see. And there, in that eerie, dark location described by witnesses as the middle of nowhere, Wayne Cousins raped and murdered Sarah Everard. He strangled her. He took every bit of light, every bit of hope, every bit of future from a woman who had done nothing wrong. At around 12:45 p.m. on March 4th, Cousins bought petrol at a service station in Whitfield. He used that petrol to burn Sarah's body and possessions in the woodland. Later, he purchased 2 rubble bags from B&Q, which he used to move and hide her remains in a nearby pond. In the early hours of March 9th, around 12:45 a.m., Cousins was captured on CCTV driving near Hoad Wood. He returned at dawn and left the site before first light. At 8:30 a.m., he returned the rental car. At 9:30 a.m., he disposed of Sarah's phone in a stream in Sandwich. Approximately 40 minutes before police arrived to arrest him later that day, Cousins wiped his phone of all data. When officers took him into custody, he initially denied knowing who Sarah was. Then he concocted an elaborate false story about being blackmailed by an Eastern European gang who had forced him to kidnap a woman. He claimed he was in financial trouble, that he'd been ripped off by a call girl, that a gang at the Burston Hotel in Folkestone had threatened him, that he'd driven around randomly until he saw Sarah, that he'd abducted her and handed her over to the gang, and that he had no idea what happened to her after that. It was all lies. Every word of it. Deliberately, Cousins hit his head on a toilet bowl before formal police interviews, requiring medical treatment. During questioning, he refused to answer questions. He showed no genuine remorse, only self-pity and an attempt to minimize what he'd done. But the evidence was overwhelming. The CCTV footage, the rental car records, the phone data, the witness statements, the location of Sarah's remains in the woodland he owned. Everything pointed to his guilt. On July 9, 2021, Wayne Cousins appeared at the Old Bailey by video link from Belmarsh High Security Prison. He pleaded guilty to kidnapping, rape, and murder. On September 29th and 30th, 2021, the sentencing hearing took place at the Old Bailey London Central Criminal Court. For the first time, the full details of Cousins' crimes were revealed in open court. The nation listened in horror. Sarah's family gave victim impact statements, their voices heavy with grief. Susan Everard, Sarah's mother, spoke of her daughter as "my precious little girl," describing her kindness, her talent for dance, all the lovely things about her. "I yearn for her," she said. "I remember all the lovely things about her." Jeremy Everard, Sarah's father, described their close-knit family, how Sarah had been saving for a house, how they'd been looking forward to grandchildren. "We loved being a part of Sarah's world and expected her to have a full and happy life," he said. Katie Everard, Sarah's elder sister, called her the very best person, with so many people who love and cherish her. In their family's later statement, they made clear where they placed the blame. "It is obvious that Wayne Cousins should never have been a police officer. We believe that Sarah died because he was a police officer. She would never have got into a stranger's car. Lord Justice Fulford, presiding over the case, described the circumstances as devastating, tragic, and wholly brutal. He noted that Colvins had shown no genuine contrition, only evident self-pity and attempts to avoid or minimize the proper consequences of his actions. On September 30th, 2021, Wayne Couzens was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order. This means he will die in prison. He will never be released. He will never walk free. Lord Justice Fulford explained the severity of the sentence. The misuse of a police officer's role, such as occurred in this case, in order to kidnap, rape, and murder a lone victim, is of equal seriousness as a murder for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. All of these situations attack different aspects of the fundamental underpinnings of our democratic way of life. It was an exceptionally rare sentence. Whole life orders are reserved for the most heinous crimes. The use of his position as a police officer to detain Sarah was the vital factor that made the case exceptionally high in seriousness. Cressida Dick, who was commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time, spoke outside the Old Bailey, her voice filled with emotion. "I feel sickened, angered, and devastated by Couzens's crimes. They are dreadful, and everyone in policing feels betrayed." In October 2021, Couzens appealed his sentence, arguing that a whole life order had never been given for a single murder not involving terrorism. In July 2022, the Court of Appeal rejected his appeal. The sentence stood. In March 2022, Couzens was charged with 4 additional counts of indecent exposure related to incidents in January and February 2021. On February 13th, 2023, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of indecent exposure committed between November 2020 and February 2021. He was sentenced to an additional 19 months, though it made no practical difference. He was already serving a whole life term. As of December 2021, Wayne Couzens is imprisoned at HM Prison Franklin in County Durham, the same county where Sarah had spent some of her happiest years as a university student. The murder of Sarah Everard sparked something unprecedented in Britain. On March 13th, 2021, just days after her body was discovered, vigils were planned across the country to honor Sarah's memory and to protest violence against women. The vigil on Clapham Common, near where Sarah had been kidnapped, became particularly significant. Throughout the early part of the day, hundreds of people came to pay their respects. They laid flowers, lit candles, shared messages of solidarity. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, attended quietly, with Kensington Palace later releasing a statement, saying she remembers what it was like to walk around London at night before she was married. As evening fell, a crowd of several hundred gathered at the park's bandstand. The direct action group Sisters Uncut encouraged people to attend with your sadness and your rage. But COVID-19 restrictions were still in place, limiting public gatherings. What happened next became deeply controversial. The Metropolitan Police moved in to break up the crowd. Officers physically grabbed women, pushing them to the ground, trampling the flowers they'd laid for Sarah. 4 people were arrested for public order offenses and for breaching the Coronavirus Act. The images went viral. Women being manhandled by police at a vigil for a woman murdered by a police officer. The irony was not lost on anyone. The optics were devastating. Public anger erupted. Protests broke out in Westminster and other locations across London, both mourning Sarah and criticizing the Met Police's handling of the vigil. Some demonstrations also protested the police crime sentencing and courts bill, which would restrict protest rights. 7 more arrests were made. The conversation expanded beyond Sarah's individual case to broader issues of women's safety, male violence, and the culture within policing. On March 11, 2021, Home Secretary Priti Patel stated that every woman should feel safe to walk on our streets without fear of harassment or violence. London Mayor Sadiq Khan declared that London streets are not safe for women or girls. New laws were discussed to protect women against sexual harassment in public, including potentially making public harassment a specifically defined crime. But statements and discussions weren't enough for many. The failures that allowed Couzens to continue as a police officer demanded accountability. In July 2021, the Metropolitan Police held a disciplinary hearing and dismissed Couzens with immediate effect. The force announced it would stop deploying lone plainclothes officers. The Independent Office for Police Conduct launched investigations into whether previous reports of indecent exposure by Cousins had been dealt with appropriately. In May 2023, Samantha Lee, the Metropolitan Police officer who failed to properly investigate the McDonald's incident, was found guilty of gross misconduct. She was sacked and barred from working as a police officer. Lee later told BBC News she believed she had been made a scapegoat for wider issues within the force. In November 2024, 3 more Metropolitan Police officers face consequences for improperly accessing confidential files related to Sarah's murder. Miles McHugh was dismissed for gross misconduct. Hannah Rebeck and Mark Harper were also found guilty of gross misconduct. Rebeck had already left the force, but would have been dismissed if still serving. Harper received a final written warning. 5 other officers faced misconduct proceedings over social media messages related to Cousins during his time on the force. In November 2021, the Home Office commissioned an independent inquiry, led by Dame Alicia Angelini, to investigate how Cousins was permitted to serve as a police officer despite his history. The inquiry was divided into parts. Part 1 focused on Cousins' career and whether red flags were missed. Part 2 would examine broader issues in policing culture and protection of women. In March 2023, the Casey Review, commissioned by the Metropolitan Police in the wake of Sarah's murder, delivered damning findings. The report concluded that the Met Police is institutionally racist, homophobic, and misogynist. It suggested there may be more officers like Cousins and another rapist officer, David Carrick, still in its ranks. On February 29, 2024, the first part of the Angelini inquiry was published. Its findings were devastating and unequivocal. Wayne Cousins should never have been a police officer. Evidence of his preference for violent and extreme pornography dated back nearly 20 years before Sarah's murder. He had allegedly committed a serious sexual assault against a child described as barely in her teens. When he was in his early 20s, there were allegations he possessed indecent images of children. The inquiry identified at least 5 incidents of sexual offending that were never reported to police, and it believed there were likely more victims. The inquiry found that Cousins' crimes were not isolated acts, but the culmination of a trajectory of sexually motivated behavior and offending, including indecent exposure, sexual assault, sexual touching, and sharing unsolicited photos of his genitals. 3 police forces: Kent Police, the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, and the Metropolitan Police Service, had all failed. They allowed him the privilege of being a police officer when they should have stopped him. They repeatedly ignored red flags. In 2015, when Kent Police received a report of indecent exposure linked to Cousins, it wasn't properly investigated. The inquiry stated it was in no doubt that the failure to investigate the June 2015 report of indecent exposure was a red flag, and a missed opportunity to disrupt or even prevent further offending. This failure allowed him to continue as an authorized firearms officer. The investigations into the February 2021 McDonald's incidents were met with what the inquiry described as apathy and disinterest. Officers looked for reasons not to pursue the cases. Both investigations seemed destined to fail from the start due to poor recording, decision-making, and a lack of positive steps to identify the perpetrator. The victims who reported Cousins' offenses were not taken sufficiently seriously by the police. Officers who responded were not adequately trained, equipped, or motivated to treat these crimes with the gravity they deserved. Cousins had entered into an individual voluntary arrangement, a form of personal debt management, in February 2007. This financial instability should have been a red flag during vetting, yet somehow he passed. In 2008, Cousins had been refused vetting clearance by Kent Police for a regular officer post, though the full documentation no longer exists to confirm the exact reason. Despite this refusal, he was later able to join the Civil Nuclear Constabulary and then transfer to the Metropolitan Police. Perhaps most shockingly, the inquiry found that even after Cousins' arrest and after a review of his vetting clearance, the Met told the inquiry in 2022 that they would still have recruited him if provided with the same information. Lady Angelini wrote, "I found this astonishing." She concluded repeated failures in recruitment and vetting meant that Cousins could enjoy the powers and privileges that accompany the role of a police officer. He went on to use his knowledge of police powers to falsely arrest Sarah Everard. The report called for a radical overhaul of police vetting and recruitment to prevent future offenders from abusing police powers for sexual purposes. Home Secretary James Cleverly, acknowledged that Sarah was failed in more ways than one, by the people who were meant to keep her safe. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley called the report an urgent call to action for all of us in policing. But for women across Britain, these words felt hollow. A YouGov poll released in November 2021 found that 76% of women believed police culture had to change, and 47% of women had decreased trust in police following Sarah's murder. By 2024, only 41% of women in London said they would trust individual officers. That figure fell to 37% among women from minoritized communities. Sarah Everard's family issued a statement saying, "Now is the time for change." Organizations advocating for women's safety called for closer working between police and specialist violence against women organizations. They demanded independent reporting and investigation systems to allow victims of police perpetrators to come forward. They called for real steps to rebuild survivors' trust, focusing on significant investment in officer training and addressing discriminatory cultures including misogyny, racism, homophobia, and ableism. But change has been painfully slow. Since Sarah's murder, revelations have continued to emerge almost weekly about sexual and violent crimes against women and girls committed by serving and former police officers. Some worked in the force for decades, committing multiple sexual assaults with seemingly no consequences. Bullying, racist, and sexist cultures have been exposed through WhatsApp messages and group chats. Female officers have reported alarming levels of sexual harassment and serious sexual assault by male colleagues. The names of other victims have entered public consciousness. Zura Alina, Biba Henry, Nicole Smallman, Sabina Nessa. These women, and more than 100 women each year in Britain who lose their lives to violence, and the tens of thousands experiencing violence and abuse that goes unreported or unpunished. Sarah's death was supposed to be a watershed moment, a point from which everything would change. But for many, the response has felt insufficient. The structural problems that allowed Wayne Couzens to continue as a police officer for so long remain largely unaddressed. Lady Angelini believes that a murder like Sarah's could happen again. That is the most chilling conclusion of all. At Durham University, where Sarah spent 3 of the happiest years of her life, the community came together to mourn one of their own. On March 15, 2021, a vigil was held at Palace Green, where members of the university community wrote messages of hope, love, and support, and lit candles in Sarah's honor. Vice-Chancellor Stuart Corbridge released a statement. Sarah was a popular and lively member of our university community and retained a large Durham University friendship group. Our thoughts remain with her family and friends. The university established a webpage where former students, faculty, and staff could share tributes and memories of Sarah. The page filled with heartfelt messages from people who had known her and from many who hadn't but felt connected to her through the Durham community. One alumna who met Sarah briefly while traveling in South America wrote about encountering her in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. Though they didn't stay in touch, she wanted Sarah's family to know that Sarah had touched people even in brief encounters halfway around the world. Another Durham student who had played rugby alongside some of Sarah's close friends wrote about Sunday mornings at Maiden Castle, about the community they'd shared, about the loss they all felt. The tributes painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely beloved, not in the sanitized way people sometimes speak of the dead, but in the real, specific, detailed way that comes from true affection. Sarah, who would drop everything to support a friend. Sarah, who loved live music and festivals. Sarah, who was excited about her new job. Sarah, who called her friend every day after that friend's mother died. Sarah, who was, in her sister's words, the very best person. On what would have been Sarah's birthday, on anniversaries of her death, flowers still appear on Clapham Common. People who never knew her come to remember her, to honor her, to stand in solidarity with her family and with all women who live with the threat of male violence. Sarah's name has become a symbol, a rallying cry. She was just walking home became a phrase that encapsulated the rage and fear women feel. Because Sarah did everything right. She was on a well-lit road. She was on the phone with her boyfriend. She was being safe, and none of it mattered, because the danger came from the person who was supposed to represent safety. The murder of Sarah Everard is not just a story about one man's evil. It's a story about systemic failure. It's about a culture within policing that allowed warning signs to be ignored. that allowed a predator to continue wearing a badge and carrying a gun. It's about the way society treats crimes against women, the way indecent exposure is dismissed as just flashing, the way reports are met with apathy instead of urgency. Sarah Everard should be alive today. She should be living in the house she was saving for. She should have married Josh. She should have given her parents the grandchildren they were looking forward to. She should have continued being an exceptional friend, a brilliant colleague, a beloved daughter and sister. But Wayne Couzens took all of that away. And the systems that should have stopped him failed, again and again and again. Sarah's family said it best, now is the time for change. The question is whether we as a society will actually deliver that change, or whether we'll allow another Sarah Everard to happen because we didn't take the warning signs seriously enough, because we didn't value women's safety enough, because we didn't hold institutions accountable enough. Sarah's life mattered. Her death demands more than statements and inquiries. It demands action. It demands transformation. It demands that we never forget her name, and never stop fighting for the world she deserved to live in. Rest in peace, Sarah Everard. June 14th, 1987 to March 3rd, 2021. Taken far too soon. Forever remembered. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a story that speaks to the darkness that can hide behind familiar faces. This is the story of Haley Anderson, a young woman whose future was stolen from her by someone she once trusted. So as we settle in, let me tell you about a case that crossed international borders and tested two justice systems. On Long Island, New York, in the quiet suburb of Westbury, there lived a family named Anderson. Karen and Gordon Anderson had two daughters, and their eldest, Haley, was born on May 9th, 1995. From the moment she could walk, Haley had this energy about her. Friends would later describe her as literal sunshine. She wasn't just someone who entered a room, she transformed it. Haley was the kind of older sister every younger sibling hopes for. Her little sister, Madeline, looked up to her with the sort of admiration that only comes from genuine love. Even when Karen and Gordon's marriage ended in divorce, Haley maintained strong relationships with both parents. She understood that families come in all shapes, and love doesn't diminish just because circumstances change. As Haley grew older, her personality crystallized into something remarkable. She was driven, yes, but not in a cutthroat way. She had compassion woven into her ambition, when other teenagers were still figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. Haley already knew. She wanted to help people. She wanted to heal them. She wanted to be a nurse. Her academic record spoke for itself. Straight A's throughout high school. But Haley wasn't just about books and grades. She had a love for music that ran deep. She would lose herself in songs, letting melodies wash over her. Friends remember her as someone who was always there when you needed her. Someone who listened without judgment. Someone who made you feel seen. When it came time to look at colleges, Haley and her mother visited several campuses. But when they walked onto the grounds of Binghamton University in upstate New York, something clicked. Haley turned to her mother and said, "This is it. This is where I'm supposed to be." There was certainty in her voice, the kind of knowing that comes from somewhere deeper than logic. She applied to Binghamton's nursing program for her junior year. The program was competitive, demanding, rigorous, but Haley got in. Of course she did. And once she was there, she threw herself into her studies with the same bright energy she brought to everything else. To help pay for school and gain experience, Haley got a job at Jazzman's, an on-campus coffee shop. For over 3 years she worked there, greeting students with that trademark smile, learning their regular orders, making the space a little warmer just by being in it. Her coworkers loved her. Her customers loved her. Everyone loved Haley. By March 2018, Haley was a 22-year-old fifth-year senior. Graduation was just 2 months away. She had already secured a job with Northwell Health, set to work in the emergency room of one of their Long Island hospitals. She would be close to home again, close to her family. Everything was falling into place. But in the background of Haley's bright future, shadows were gathering. Shadows cast by someone who claimed to care about her. Orlando Tercero was born in Miami, Florida, but his story began in Nicaragua. His parents were Nicaraguan, and his father was a doctor. The family split their time between the United States and Nicaragua, giving Orlando dual citizenship. It was a privilege that would later become crucial to how this story unfolded. Orlando, like Haley, wanted to follow a path of healing. He enrolled at Binghamton University as a nursing student, hoping to follow in his father's footsteps in the medical field. On paper, Orlando and Haley had much in common. Both were nursing students. Both were dedicated to their studies. Both were in their early 20s, navigating the complex social world of college life. They met during Haley's sophomore year in the nursing program. It was 2016, and their friendship developed naturally. Study sessions turned into coffee dates. Coffee dates turned into longer conversations. Eventually, those conversations turned into something more complicated. Haley's mother, Karen, later explained that her daughter and Orlando had developed what she called a friendship that became romantic. But it was never quite a relationship in the traditional sense. They were never committed to each other. Haley saw it as casual, a connection that filled a space in her life, but didn't define it. To her, Orlando was a friend with benefits. Someone she cared about, certainly, but not someone she was planning a future with. Orlando's roommate, Jesse Bia, would later tell investigators that Orlando cared deeply for Haley, perhaps too deeply, because while Haley saw their connection as casual and flexible, Orlando seemed to see something more permanent, something more possessive. For about a year and a half, they continued their on and off dynamic. Sometimes they were close. Sometimes they pulled apart. Haley was dating other people. She had a boyfriend named Kevin Ocampo, someone she genuinely connected with. As graduation approached, Haley started thinking seriously about her future. Did she want to be in a serious relationship? Did she want to commit to anyone right now when her whole life was about to change? She and Kevin talked about maybe putting things on hold for a while. It was a mature conversation, the kind that comes from two people who respect each other enough to be honest about their feelings and their uncertainties. But Orlando wasn't part of these mature conversations. He watched from the sidelines as Haley reconnected with Kevin, as she talked about her future, as she made plans that didn't include him, and something inside Orlando began to twist. In September 2017, 6 months before Haley's murder, something happened that should have been a warning. Haley hosted or attended a party at Orlando's apartment. During that party, Orlando confronted Haley about her relationship with Kevin, who was a mutual friend of theirs. Witnesses said Orlando shouted at her. Then, perhaps realizing he'd gone too far, he tried to smooth things over by offering her alcohol. Haley declined, but the tension didn't end there. Shortly after that party, someone slashed the tires on Haley's car. The damage cost her about $600. Haley had a strong suspicion about who was responsible. She believed it was Orlando. Her friends believed it was Orlando, but Haley made a choice that in hindsight would haunt those who loved her. She didn't press charges. She didn't want to ruin Orlando's nursing career, even though he had allegedly damaged her property. Even though he had frightened her, she still cared enough about his future to protect it. That was Haley. That was the kind of person she was. By March 2018, Haley had made her decision clear to Orlando. She wanted to end any romantic involvement between them. She wanted to be friends. Just friends. Nothing more. For Haley, this was a reasonable boundary. She was about to graduate. She was about to start her career. She wanted to move forward. For Orlando, it was rejection. And he could not accept it. Thursday, March 8th, 2018, started like many college nights. Haley and her roommates, Josie Artin and Michelle Tapali, were up late playing board games and drinking. It was the kind of casual, easy fun that defines college friendships. There was laughter, there were inside jokes, there was the comfortable feeling of being with people who knew you well. Around 4 in the morning, they finally called it a night and went to their respective rooms. Haley was tired, but happy. She went to bed thinking about ordinary things. Classes, graduation, her future job. She had no reason to think this night would be different from any other. But at some point after her roommates went to sleep, Haley left their apartments. Surveillance footage would later show that at 3:15 a.m., Haley and Orlando Tercero entered his off-campus apartment together on Oak Street on Binghamton's west side. What happened in those early morning hours? Only Orlando truly knows. But the evidence tells a story of violence and betrayal. Investigators believe that Haley, who had been drinking, likely fell asleep in Orlando's apartment. Perhaps she trusted him enough to let her guard down. Perhaps she still saw him as a friend, someone who wouldn't hurt her. Perhaps she was simply too tired and too intoxicated to recognize the danger she was in. While Haley slept, or perhaps as she was waking, Orlando strangled her. The autopsy would later reveal that she died from asphyxiation due to manual neck compression and ligature strangulation from the necklace she was wearing. He used his hands. He used her own jewelry. He took the life of a young woman who had shown him nothing but kindness, even when he didn't deserve it. The pathologist, James Terzian, would later testify about the marks on Haley's neck. He determined that death came from asphyxiation. It would have taken several minutes during which Haley would have struggled, would have fought, would have looked into the eyes of someone she once cared about, and seen only murderous rage. When it was over, Orlando didn't call for help. He didn't try to revive her. He didn't show remorse in the moment. Instead, surveillance footage shows him leaving his apartment alone, approximately 7 hours after he and Haley had entered together. But the footage reveals even more disturbing details about Orlando's state of mind. At some point after killing Haley, Orlando left his apartment and went to a drugstore. He purchased melatonin and Z-Quil. Investigators believe he was planning to take his own life. He returned to his apartment. In the basement, he retrieved some eye hooks. In a doorway, police would later find a tie hanging from those hooks, and blood on the floor beneath. The evidence suggested that Orlando attempted to hang himself, but fell, injuring himself in the process. In his apartment, police found a note written in Spanish. "I never imagined doing this. I'm sorry," it read. But the apology was not addressed to Haley. It was addressed to his family. Orlando hadn't just destroyed Haley's life. He destroyed his own. And in those hours after the murder, as Haley's body lay in his bed, he made a decision. He wouldn't face the consequences of what he'd done. He would run. More surveillance footage shows Orlando at JFK International Airport, luggage in hand, a bandage on his head covering the injury from his failed suicide attempt. He boarded a flight to Nicaragua. He landed there on Friday, March 9th, at 3:55 in the afternoon. By the time his plane touched down in his parents' homeland, Haley's friends were starting to worry. Friday came and went. Haley's roommates, Josie and Michelle, hadn't heard from her since the night before. At first, they weren't alarmed. Haley was independent, social, always going somewhere. But as Friday evening approached, concerns started to creep in. Haley was supposed to meet them at a local bar. It was the kind of casual plan they made all the time. But Haley didn't show up. That alone was odd, but what really worried them was the silence. Haley was always on social media. She was always texting. She always responded to her friends, but now there was nothing. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. Something was wrong. Michelle remembered that Haley had the Find My Friends app on her iPhone. She pulled up the app, hoping to see that Haley was at the library, or at a coffee shop, or anywhere that would explain the silence. The app loaded. Haley's phone pinged at a location off campus, Orlando Tercero's apartment. The roommates looked at each other. They knew about Orlando. They knew about the complicated dynamic between him and Haley. Michelle would later tell reporters that Haley had viewed the relationship as platonic, but Orlando had been obsessed with her. They hooked up in the past, but to her, it was pretty platonic and she didn't want to have anything seriously. Michelle explained. The roommates decided to go to Orlando's apartment. They knocked on the door, no answer. They knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. They tried calling Haley's phone. They could hear it ringing inside the apartment, but no one came to the door. Fear turned into panic. They called 911. When police arrived to do a welfare check on the morning of March 9th, they also received no response at Orlando's door. They left, but the investigation was just beginning. At some point, whether through the landlord or forced entry, Haley's roommates or the police gained access to the apartment. And there in Orlando's bedroom, they found her. Haley Anderson, 22 years old, just 2 months from graduation, was dead. Her body was partially tucked into Orlando's bed. The apartment was otherwise empty. Orlando was gone. When Binghamton police realized they were dealing with a homicide, they immediately began searching for Orlando Tercero. They discovered that early on March 9th, Orlando's sister had received a disturbing text from him. He told her he had done something bad and that he was a disgrace to the family. Alarmed, his sister had called 911, which had prompted that first welfare check. But by the time police arrived at the apartment, Orlando was already out of the country. Investigators accessed security footage from various locations and pieced together Orlando's movements. They saw him and Haley entering his apartment together. They saw him leave alone. They saw him at the drugstore. They saw him at JFK Airport. And then he was gone. Police determined that Orlando had left the United States by international flight before Haley's body was even discovered. They put out an alert. They contacted federal authorities. And they contacted Nicaraguan officials. On March 11th, 2 days after Haley's body was found, Orlando was officially named as the prime suspect. On March 13th, just days after fleeing the country, Orlando was apprehended by Nicaraguan National Police at the Hospital de Leon. He had attempted suicide after arriving in Nicaragua and had been placed in a psychiatric hospital. When police arrived to arrest him, he was still receiving medical treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. From the hospital, he was taken to the Directorate of Judicial Assistance in Managua, known as El Chipote. On March 17th, Broome County officials charged Orlando with second-degree murder. If convicted in the United States, he would face up to life in prison. The district attorney, Steve Cornwell, formally released a warrant for Orlando's arrest and detailed how Haley's roommates had found her body. But there was a significant problem. Nicaragua does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. And because Orlando held dual citizenship, Nicaragua was not obligated to send him back to face American justice. In fact, the Nicaraguan authorities made it clear that Orlando would be tried under Nicaraguan law. This created an unusual situation. Here was a murder that happened on American soil, involving an American victim and an American Nicaraguan perpetrator. But the trial would take place in a completely different country with completely different laws. The Anderson family was devastated. Not only had they lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, but now they faced the uncertainty of whether justice would even be served. Would Nicaragua take this case seriously? Would they let Orlando off easy? Would he find some loophole to escape punishment? But then something unexpected happened. The Nicaraguan government decided to charge Orlando, not just with murder, but with femicide. Femicide is a specific charge in Nicaraguan law that doesn't exist in the United States. It refers to the murder of a woman based on her gender, committed by someone who had a relationship with the victim. It's treated as a hate crime, and it carries severe penalties. The two governments began working together in an unprecedented way. American prosecutors collaborated with Nicaraguan authorities. Evidence was shared across borders. Witnesses would testify via video link from the United States. It wasn't the trial Karen and Gordon Anderson had hoped for, but it was a chance at justice. In September 2019, more than a year after Haley's murder, Orlando Tercero's trial began in Nicaragua. It was unlike any American trial. There was no jury. Instead, a single judge, Fabiola Betancourt, would hear all the evidence and render a verdict. Orlando was not required to enter a plea, and the Anderson family would have to watch via video link their daughter's murder being tried thousands of miles away in a system they didn't fully understand. The prosecution laid out a straightforward case. They argued that Orlando had killed Haley because she didn't want to be with him. It was her decision to make, but it was one he couldn't accept. If he couldn't have her, nobody else would. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed Haley and Orlando entering his apartment together at 3:15 a.m. on March 8th. 7 hours later, Orlando left alone. Surveillance from the drugstore showed him purchasing items consistent with a suicide attempt. Airport cameras captured him fleeing the country with a bandage on his head. Inside the apartment, police had found evidence of Orlando's suicide attempt. The tie hanging from hooks. The blood on the floor. The note apologizing to his family. The pathologist testified about Haley's injuries. The marks on her neck. The cause of death. But perhaps most damning was the timeline itself. Orlando had strangled Haley, likely while she slept, and he'd attempted to take his own life. When that failed, he'd fled the country before her body was even discovered. These were not the actions of an innocent man. These were not even the actions of someone who had committed a crime of passion in a moment of temporary insanity. These were the calculated actions of someone who knew exactly what he had done and was trying to escape the consequences. The prosecution argued that Orlando had been obsessing over Haley for months. They brought up the tire-slashing incident from September 2017. They discussed the confrontation at the party. They painted a picture of a man who had been rejected and had decided that rejection was unacceptable. District Attorney Steve Cornwell, working with Nicaraguan prosecutors from New York, was blunt in his assessment. He choked her to death. He took Haley, who I believe may have been sleeping, and choked the life out of her and left her there. Cornwell said, "That is sick. A disturbed man could take advantage of somebody he claimed to love and kill her because he couldn't have her." But Orlando's defense attorney, Eduardo Ruby, had a different story to tell, and it was one that terrified the Anderson family. Orlando's defense was simple. He didn't remember any of it. His attorney argued that due to the influence of alcohol, Orlando was temporarily insane at the time of Haley's murder. He called only one witness to support this claim, a court-appointed psychiatrist named Dr. Ronald Lopez Aguilar. Dr. Lopez Aguilar testified that when he examined Orlando claimed he had been drinking heavily that night and woke up to find Haley dead. He had no idea what had happened. He had no memory of strangling her. The alcohol had caused temporary insanity, and he couldn't be held fully responsible for actions he didn't remember. Karen Anderson sat thousands of miles away, watching this testimony via video link, feeling her heart sink. The insanity plea. It was the one thing she'd been worried about. Would the judge believe it? Would Orlando walk free because he claimed he'd been too drunk to remember murdering her daughter? But there were significant problems with Orlando's defense. Dr. Lopez Aguilar admitted he couldn't verify whether Orlando's claims were true. He couldn't determine what Orlando's state of mind had been at the time of the murder. He could only testify about Orlando's current mental state, which according to the doctor was perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with Orlando's mind now. Moreover, there was no evidence that Orlando had been drunk. There were no blood alcohol tests. No witnesses testified that he'd been drinking heavily. The only person claiming Orlando had been intoxicated was Orlando himself, and he had every reason to lie. And then there were Orlando's actions after the murder. He hadn't called 911. He hadn't sought help for Haley. Instead, he'd gone to a drugstore, purchased sleep aids, attempted suicide, written a note, and then when that failed, carefully planned his escape. He'd packed a suitcase. He'd driven to JFK Airport. He'd boarded an international flight. He'd fled to a country where he knew he couldn't be extradited. These were not the actions of someone who was temporarily insane. These were not the actions of someone who didn't know what he'd done. These were the deliberate, calculated actions of someone trying to avoid the consequences of murder. Steve Cornwell was scathing in his dismissal of the defense. "It's indefensible." It was an indefensible case, he said. "I would say there is absolutely no possibility that he doesn't remember what happened. There is no evidence that he was drunk or on drugs. There's no evidence that he had some sleepwalking disorder and commits murder in his sleep." After both sides rested their cases, Judge Betancourt did something that would never happen in an American courtroom. Before rendering her verdict, she allowed Haley's family to speak. Via video link thousands of miles from the courtroom where her daughter's killer sat, Karen Anderson addressed the court. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could hear the ocean of grief beneath every word. "Haley was a beautiful, intelligent, and friendly girl," she said. "She was an aspiring nurse and had her whole life to look forward to. She was and still is my best friend. So thank you for listening and letting me speak on behalf of my daughter." Those few sentences carried the weight of a mother's love, a mother's loss, a mother's desperate need for justice. In them was every memory of Haley, as a baby, as a little girl, as a teenager, as a young woman about to conquer the world. In them was every conversation Karen would never have with her daughter, every graduation that wouldn't happen, every wedding that wouldn't happen, every grandchild that wouldn't be born. When Karen finished speaking, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Betancourt called a brief recess. Steve Cornwell expected the judge would need at least a day to deliberate. The evidence was extensive. The case was complex. The stakes were enormous. But Judge Betancourt had heard enough. After just an hour and a half, she returned to the courtroom. Orlando Tercero was guilty of femicide. The Anderson family, watching from New York, felt something break open inside them. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just a small, quiet acknowledgement that the truth had been recognized. That Haley's life had been valued. That her death had not been dismissed as a tragic accident or a crime of passion that could be excused. The verdict sent a clear message. Orlando had murdered Haley Anderson because she was a woman who had dared to reject him. He had killed her because he believed he had a right to her body, her affection, her future, and when she made it clear that she belonged only to herself, he had taken everything from her. The sentencing hearing came later. Judge Betancourt sentenced Orlando Tercero to 30 years in a Nicaraguan prison, 30 years in a facility known for overcrowding, where he would be fed small meals of rice and beans, where his mother would have to bring additional food to the prison gates if he wanted more to eat. For many crimes, 30 years might seem like a lengthy sentence, but for taking the life of a 22-year-old woman who had her whole future ahead of her, 30 years felt inadequate. Karen Anderson would later say she didn't think even 30 years was enough. In March 2020, Orlando filed an appeal, hoping to get his sentence reduced. The Anderson family had to relive their nightmare all over again, wondering if some legal technicality would allow their daughter's killer to serve less time. But the Nicaraguan appeals court denied the appeal. The conviction and sentence would stand. If Orlando is ever released from prison, if he ever tries to return to the United States, he will immediately face arrest. The second-degree murder charge in Broome County still stands. There is no double jeopardy between two different countries' justice systems. He could be tried all over again in American court. Steve Cornwell has made that abundantly clear. But for now, Orlando sits in a Nicaraguan prison, and the Anderson family tries to rebuild their lives around the gaping hole that Haley's absence has left. After the trial, after the verdict, after the appeal was denied, those who loved Haley Anderson faced the hardest task of all: learning to live in a world without her. Gordon Anderson, Haley's father, spoke about the verdict bringing a measure of justice. There was some ease to the heartache and a little bit of a conclusion, he said. I mean, it's not over, and there will always be an emptiness that's there, but it was nice to see that Nicaragua did a really professional bang-up job to get the job done. Karen Anderson focused on gratitude for the legal system that had convicted Orlando. When this all started, I just kept my faith in the system, and keeping my faith in the system proved to be the right thing to do, she said. But those who know Karen understand that no verdict, no prison sentence, no amount of justice can bring back the person she loves most in the world. Madeline Anderson lost her big sister, her role model, her best friend. She had to watch as the details of Haley's murder were presented in court, as a pathologist described exactly how her sister died, as defense attorneys tried to excuse the inexcusable. Josie Artin and Mishala Tapali, Haley's roommates, carry the trauma of finding their friend's body. They live with the knowledge that if they'd been more worried earlier, if they'd checked on Haley sooner, maybe, though this is not their burden to carry, things might have been different. Haley's friends and colleagues at Jazzman's coffee shop remember her smile, her kindness, her ability to make everyone feel welcome. The nursing students who studied alongside her remember her compassion, her dedication, her dream of working in an emergency room where she could save lives. Northwell Health, the hospital system that had hired Haley, lost a nurse who would have been extraordinary. The emergency room where she was supposed to work lost someone who would have brought light to the darkest, most desperate moments of people's lives. And every person whose life Haley would have touched, every patient she would have cared for, every colleague she would have mentored, every friend she would have made in the decades she should have had, all of them lost something too, though they'll never know it. In the quiet moments when the legal proceedings are over and the news cameras have moved on to other tragedies, there are questions that haunt those who loved Haley. Could this have been prevented? Haley didn't press charges when her tires were slashed. She wanted to protect Orlando's nursing career, wanted to believe the best in someone she'd once cared about. Would pressing charges have made a difference? Would it have put Orlando on law enforcement's radar? Would it have led to intervention before violence escalated to murder? There's no way to know. And the burden of that question shouldn't fall on Haley's memory. She was kind. She was forgiving. These were not flaws. These were the best parts of her humanity. What about the warning signs? Orlando confronted Haley at a party. He allegedly damaged her property. He couldn't accept her rejection. Friends knew he was obsessed. But obsession is disturbingly common. Most people who are rejected, even those who struggle to accept it, don't murder. How do we identify the ones who will? How do we protect people without criminalizing emotions? These are the impossible questions that follow every case like this. Questions without easy answers. Questions that keep activists and legislators and loved ones awake at night. What is clear is that femicide is real. The murder of women by men who believe they have ownership over women's bodies, women's choices, women's futures. It happens with devastating frequency. In the United States alone, approximately 3 women are murdered by intimate partners or former intimate partners every single day. Haley Anderson was studying to be a nurse because she wanted to help people. She believed in healing and compassion and giving people second chances. Orlando Tercero took advantage of that compassion. He interpreted her kindness as weakness, her forgiveness as permission, her friendship as possession. And on March 8, 2018, when Haley made it clear that she belonged only to herself, he decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about Haley Anderson. Not as a victim, though she was one. Not as a cautionary tale, though her story carries warnings. Think of her as she was, a young woman full of light and promise. Someone who worked 3 years at a coffee shop that knew her regulars' orders by heart. Someone who played board games with her roommates until 4 in the morning. Someone who loved music and dreamed of saving lives in an emergency room. Think of her mother, Karen, who lost her best friend. Think of her father, Gordon, trying to find ease in heartache. Think of her sister, Madeline, navigating life without the person who was supposed to be there for all of it. And perhaps in the quiet of the night, think about the people in your own life. The ones you love. The ones who light up rooms just by entering them. The ones whose futures seem so bright and certain that you can't imagine a world without them. Hold them a little closer. Tell them you love them a little more often. Because Haley Anderson's story reminds us that life is fragile, that evil can wear a familiar face, and that every moment we have with the people we love is a gift that can be stolen away in an instant. Haley should be 32 years old now. She should be working as a nurse. She should be saving lives. She should be laughing with her friends, calling her mother, being an aunt to Madeline's children if she has them, creating memories and building a future. Instead, she exists in photographs and memories, in the grief of those who loved her, and in the empty space at every family gathering where she should be standing. Her light was extinguished far too soon, but those who knew her are determined to keep her memory alive, to ensure that her name is remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived. Haley Elizabeth Anderson, May 9th, 1995 to March 8th, 2018. Gone but never ever forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the heart of North Dakota, where winter stretches long and cold across the prairie, there's a city called Bismarck. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where Monday nights mean bowling leagues, and where trust runs deep. This is a story about that trust, and how it was shattered on the last night of a decade. Chad Ensel was 42 years old in the winter of 2019. If you'd met him, you would have remembered him. He had one of those personalities that filled a room, warm, competitive in the best way, always ready to help someone improve their bowling game or fix something that wasn't working quite right. His sister, Lori, would later say he had a lot of hobbies. That was an understatement. Chad was an excellent bowler, the kind who could score a perfect 300 and had done it more than once. He played darts at the local spots. In the summer, he raced stock cars at the speedway, feeling the thunder of engines and the rush of competition. He coached Little League, spending his free time teaching kids the fundamentals of baseball. He golfed when the weather allowed it. Chad had been born in Halliday, a small town in North Dakota, but he'd made Bismarck his home for 2 decades. He worked for Interstate Power Company, showing up reliably, doing his job well. His co-workers liked him, his friends valued him. His ex-wife Susan, from whom he'd divorced years earlier, still spoke kindly of him, a rare thing in the aftermath of broken marriages. In 2016, Chad had found love again. He married Nikki, a woman who seemed to make him happy. Nikki had 2 young sons from a previous relationship. and Chad stepped into the role of stepfather with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else. They bought a home together on 43rd Avenue Northeast in Bismarck, a house that would become the center of a mystery that would grip this quiet community. December 2019 was cold, even by North Dakota standards. Nikki had been complaining about the furnace. She said it wasn't working properly, that the house was too cold, that she was getting sick from the chill. She'd started staying at a local hotel, the Staybridge Suites, claiming she needed warmth while the heating issue was sorted out. It seemed reasonable enough. Furnaces break. North Dakota winters are brutal. But beneath this ordinary explanation, something else was happening, something Chad didn't see coming. 4 days before Christmas on December 26th, Nikki did something that would later seem significant. She called Homesite Insurance and purchased a renter's insurance policy. The policy was worth $26,000, and it would take effect at 1 minute past midnight on December 27th. She didn't tell Chad about it. The policy was in her name alone, though the payment came from a joint account, not the one she shared with Chad, but one she shared with someone else entirely. That someone was Earl Howard, a 43-year-old man from Bellwood, Ontario, Canada. Earl had dual citizenship, American and Canadian. He was married, with a daughter. He'd met Nikki through her catering business, where he'd been a client. But their relationship had evolved into something more. In the days leading up to December 30th, surveillance footage would later show Nikki and Earl together, frequently. They were captured on camera at a local Walmart, kissing before they left. They stayed at the same hotel. They opened a joint bank account. They made plans that didn't include Chad. December 30th, 2019 was a Monday. For Chad, that meant bowling. He was a regular at Midway Lanes on Monday nights, part of a league where he competed and coached and enjoyed the camaraderie of the game. His friend Kent Heinley usually joined him, but that particular Monday, Kent wasn't feeling well and stayed home. He texted Chad the next day to check in. Chad left the bowling alley around 10:30 that night. Surveillance cameras caught him leaving, heading home to the house on 43rd Avenue. He had no idea that while he'd been bowling, his home had already become a crime scene in preparation. The security system in Chad's house was sophisticated. It had cameras, motion sensors, logs of every time someone came or went. What Chad didn't know was that these systems would tell a story he would never hear. A story of betrayal unfolding in the hours around his death. According to the security logs, Nikki and Earl had been at the house earlier that evening, around 9 or 10 o'clock, while Chad was still at the bowling alley. The cameras showed them entering, moving through the house, gathering Nikki's belongings. Earl stayed mostly outside, but Nikki went in and out, preparing. Then, between 1 and 3 in the morning on December 31st, New Year's Eve, something terrible happened in that house on 43rd Avenue. Chad didn't show up for work after the holiday. In a normal year, this might have been brushed off. Maybe he'd extended his vacation. Maybe he was sick. But Chad was reliable. His co-workers grew concerned. They tried calling Nikki, asking if she'd heard from him, if she knew where he was. According to later testimony, Nikki told them she was too busy to help look for her husband. Too busy. Her husband was missing, and she was too busy to help find him. 2 days passed. December 31st came and went. A new year beginning, a new decade starting. While Chad lay in his bedroom silent and still, on the morning of January 2nd, 2020, Nikki called 911. She reported smoke at her residence on 43rd Avenue Northeast. Something might be on fire, she told them. She sounded concerned, but not panicked. Not the way someone might sound if they thought their husband was in danger. When firefighters arrived at the house around 5:30 that evening, they found smoke, but not the roaring blaze they'd expected. The fire had been small, contained mostly to 2 areas, the master bedroom upstairs and the furnace area downstairs. 2 separate fires in 2 separate locations, which was unusual. Accidental fires don't typically start in multiple unconnected places. In the bedroom, they found Chad. He was lying on the floor, naked, his body already in the early stages of decomposition. The room smelled of smoke and something else, accelerant. A propane heater sat near the bed, positioned as if it had been meant to start a fire. On the bed lay a double-barrel shotgun and a bottle of whiskey, staged like a scene from a suicide. But this was no suicide. Chad had been shot twice with a shotgun. The medical examiner, Dr. William Masello, would later testify that either wound would have been fatal. 1 shot to the head, 1 to the torso. And here's the thing about suicide by shotgun. It's difficult to shoot yourself twice. The first shot tends to be enough. The gun's position was wrong, too. It was on the bed, not near Chad's body on the floor. And when investigators brought in an arson dog, a canine trained to detect accelerants, the dog alerted to the presence of fire-starting materials. Someone had tried to burn this house down. Someone had tried to destroy evidence. The investigators looked at each other with a grim understanding. This wasn't suicide. This wasn't an accidental fire. This was murder, dressed up to look like something else. Detective work is often portrayed as dramatic breakthroughs and sudden revelations. But the truth is usually more methodical. It's about following threads, checking cameras, pulling phone records, asking the same questions different ways until inconsistencies emerge. 5 days after they found Chad's body, on January 7th, 2020, investigators sat down with Nikki for a lengthy interview. The video of that interview would later be played for a jury, and it would prove damning. Nikki's story shifted and changed. At first, she said she'd been at the hotel, that she hadn't been to the house. Then, confronted with security footage showing her at the house, she changed her explanation. She said she'd gone to get medication. Then she said she'd heard gunshots. Then she said Earl had done it, that she'd been in the car while he went inside. The investigators watched her emotions shift, sometimes crying, sometimes defiant, sometimes confused. But underneath it all, they sensed deception. Sergeant Aaron Silbernagle, who conducted part of the interview, would later describe his method of breaking down her many stories. It was about patience, about letting her talk until the contradictions became impossible to ignore. Nikki claimed that Chad had been abusive, that he was an alcoholic, that he beat her, that she was afraid of him. She painted a picture of a monster hiding behind a friendly face. But when investigators talked to Chad's friends, his co-workers, even his ex-wife Susan, a different picture emerged. They all said the same thing. Chad was not violent. He drank socially, at bowling nights or barbecues. But he wasn't a heavy drinker. When he did drink, he became happy and easygoing, not aggressive. No one had ever seen him raise a hand to anyone. His ex-wife Susan, who had every reason to speak ill of him if it were true, said there had been no violence in their marriage. The investigators dug deeper into Nikki's life. They found Earl Howard. They found the joint bank account. They found hotel records showing Nikki and Earl staying in the same room at the Staybridge Suites. They found surveillance footage from the house showing both of them entering in the early morning hours of December 31st, staying for an hour and 40 minutes, then leaving. The security camera system controlled by Nikki's login had been turned off right around the time Chad would have been killed. Prosecutors Julie Lawyer and her team began to piece together what they believed had happened. The theory was this: Nikki and Earl had been having an affair. They wanted to be together, but Chad was in the way. More than that, Chad represented a financial opportunity. Chad had a life insurance policy worth $600,000. Nikki was the primary beneficiary. He'd taken out that policy a year earlier, with the help of his friend Kent Heinley. It was meant to protect his family, to make sure they'd be okay if something happened to him. He never imagined his wife might see it as a motive for murder. Then there was the renter's insurance. Nikki had purchased just days before Chad died, $26,000. Brand new, taking effect at midnight on December 27th. There was Chad's job at Interstate Power Company, which came with additional death benefits. Nikki had inquired about all of these within days of finding Chad's body. The renter's insurance, the life insurance, the widow's benefits. She'd made these calls while her husband's body was barely cold. The plan, as prosecutors saw it, was brutally simple. Kill Chad. Make it look like suicide. A depressed man drinking alone, shooting himself on New Year's Eve. Burn the house down to destroy evidence and collect the insurance money. Then Nikki and Earl would take all that money and start a new life together. They'd even talked about moving to Texas. But the plan had flaws. The fire hadn't caught properly the first time. According to the evidence, Nikki and Earl had positioned a propane heater near Chad's bed after shooting him, hoping it would ignite and burn the house. When it didn't work, they'd had to come back. 3 days later, on January 2nd, they returned with a gas welding torch kit that Earl had purchased earlier. They tried again, this time managing to start fires in both the bedroom and near the furnace. But even then, the fire didn't fully take hold. It smoldered rather than roared. And that meant evidence survived. The gunshot wounds, the staged suicide scene, the traces of accelerant, the security footage showing their movements. On January 8, 2020, Nikki was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit arson, and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. 2 days later, on January 10th, Earl Howard was arrested. He turned himself in rather than wait for authorities to come for him. Initially, Earl was charged with murder itself, not just conspiracy, but in May 2021 that charge was dropped. The reason was technical but significant. Ballistic experts couldn't definitively prove who had pulled the trigger. They knew Chad had been shot twice, with the shotgun found at the scene. They knew one shell casing was missing, removed, they believed, by the killers. But they couldn't say whether it was Nikki or Earl who had actually fired the shots. This uncertainty would shape the legal proceedings to come. Without being able to prove who pulled the trigger, prosecutors focused on what they could prove. That Nikki and Earl had conspired together, had planned together, had acted together to kill Chad and cover it up. In October 2021, Earl Howard's attorney reached a deal with prosecutors. Earl would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, arson, conspiracy to commit arson, and evidence tampering. In exchange, the murder charge would be dropped. On February 14, 2022, Valentine's Day, ironically, Judge David Barr sentenced Earl Howard to 25 years in prison. With North Dakota's requirement that he serve 85% of his sentence, Earl would have to spend at least 21 years behind bars before becoming eligible for parole. He was credited for the approximately 2 years he'd already spent in jail awaiting trial. At the sentencing hearing, Chad's family spoke. His mother, Deb Ensel, addressed Earl directly. "How could you do such a cruel thing to another person that you didn't even know, that did nothing to you?" she asked. Her voice carried the weight of a mother's grief. "You have taken the joy out of our lives," she continued. "You created a wound so deep it will never ever heal." Chad's sister Lori was equally devastated. "You have devastated our lives, and my family is past the brink of exhaustion," she said. Earl didn't address the court. He didn't explain himself or apologize. He simply accepted his sentence and was led away to begin serving his time. But the story wasn't over. Nikki Ensel still had to face trial. Nikki's trial began on September 27, 2022, nearly 3 years after Chad's death. It would last about 2 weeks, with testimony from 44 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The prosecution, led by Julie Lawyer, presented a methodical case. They showed the surveillance footage of Nikki and Earl entering the house while Chad was at bowling. They presented the security logs showing someone using Nikki's login to turn off cameras around the time of the murder. They displayed the renter's insurance policy, purchased just days before Chad died. They showed records of Nikki's calls to insurance companies immediately after Chad's body was found. Witness after witness testified to Chad's character, his kindness, his nonviolent nature, his social drinking rather than alcoholism. They dismantled Nikki's claims that he was abusive, that she feared him, that he was a secret monster. The medical examiner testified about the gunshot wounds and the staging of the scene. Arson experts explained about the accelerants and the 2 separate fire locations. Technology experts walked through the security system logs, showing the precise timeline of movements in and out of the house. For 6 days, the prosecution built their case, piece by piece, creating a mosaic of evidence that pointed inexorably toward one conclusion. Nikki and Earl had conspired to kill Chad, had carried out that plan, and had tried to cover it up. And then came the defense's turn. Nikki's attorney, Thomas Glass, had chosen not to give an opening statement at the start of the trial. Now as the prosecution rested, he made a surprising decision. He called no witnesses. Not one. Nikki didn't take the stand in her own defense. Instead, Glass's strategy was to raise doubt by pointing to what wasn't there. "Where's Earl Howard?" he asked the jury in his closing arguments. "I've never seen him take the stand." "Why not?" "Why is a big question, and it's unanswered." Unanswered questions raised doubt. It was true that Earl hadn't testified. He'd been on the prosecution's witness list, but they decided not to call him. Perhaps they felt their case was strong enough without him. Perhaps they worried about what he might say on cross-examination, but his absence allowed Glass to suggest that Earl alone was responsible, that Nikki was a victim rather than a co-conspirator. The jury deliberated for about 2 hours. On October 4th, 2022, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit arson. Guilty of conspiracy to tamper with evidence. The courtroom was silent. As the verdict was read, Chad's family wept with relief. Nikki showed little emotion. Nikki's sentencing was originally scheduled for early January 2023, but it was delayed when the required presence investigation report wasn't completed in time. The new date was set for February 17, 2023, almost exactly 1 year after Earl's sentencing, and more than 3 years since Chad had been killed. Before the sentencing, both Chad's mother Deb and his sister Lori addressed the court. Lori spoke directly to Nikki. "You took many things away from me," she said, "but most importantly, a piece of my heart. We are not victims, but a community of broken survivors. Chad will be forever missed. I speak for a lot of people when I say I hope you rot in eternity." Prosecutor Julie Lawyer pointed out that Nikki's statements in the presence investigation and psychological evaluation contained contradictions and what appeared to be lies. Nikki had shown no real remorse. Lawyer argued, no genuine grief over her husband's death. Instead, she'd focused on herself, on her own suffering, on blaming others. Nikki's attorney, Glass, criticized the investigation and psychological report, arguing that Earl Howard had manipulated Nikki, that she'd been under his influence. He noted that after the killing, Earl had fled to Canada while Nikki had stayed in Bismarck, suggesting this proved something about her lesser culpability. Judge Douglas Barr, who had presided over the trial as a district court judge, and had since been appointed to the state Supreme Court, but returned to finish this case, listened to all the arguments. Then he addressed Nikki directly. Barr noted that throughout the presence process, her interviews and even her final statement to the court, Nikki had focused on herself. "It's how I'm suffering, it's not how the family is suffering," Barr said. He pointed out that even without admitting guilt, she could have acknowledged the pain her family was experiencing, but she hadn't. The judge also addressed Nikki's ever-changing stories. "It seems to be an ever-changing story, depending on what fits her circumstances and what she thinks will help her," Barr said. During her final statement, Nikki had claimed for the first time that Chad had abused her children, locking them in rooms all day. This was new information that contradicted everything else she'd said. Even if there was some abuse, Barr said, there's many options short of taking someone's life. Then came the sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole. Additionally, 15 years for the other charges. Nikki would have to serve 85% of her sentence, 36 years and 25 days, before she could be considered for parole. She was 41 years old at the time. That meant she wouldn't be eligible for parole until she was in her late 70s. Nikki's attorney filed an appeal, arguing that there hadn't been sufficient evidence to prove conspiracy, that Earl Howard's failure to testify had created reasonable doubt. But in October 2023, the North Dakota Supreme Court rejected the appeal. The court ruled that there had been sufficient evidence for the jury's verdict, that the evidence allowed the jury to draw an inference reasonably tending to prove guilt, and fairly warranting a conviction. In March 2023, ABC's 2020 did a special episode about the case. Reporter John Quinones traveled to Bismarck to interview Nikki Enzel in prison, giving her the chance to tell her side of the story publicly for the first time. During that interview, Nikki continued to maintain her innocence. "I'm not the person that they portray I am," she told Quinones. She acknowledged that her story had changed many times during the investigation. "My story changes so many different times," she said, "that none of them are really consistent." But she attributed this to confusion and fear rather than guilt. When asked about her relationship with Earl Howard, Nikki denied there had been anything romantic between them. "He's not my type," she claimed. When Quinones pointed out that surveillance footage showed them kissing at Walmart, Nikki initially denied seeing any kiss. Then, in the same interview, she seemed to backtrack. "I don't know, he leaned down, I leaned up," she said. "Have I kissed many friends on the cheek? Have I kissed my kids on the cheek? Have I kissed exes on the cheek?" Yeah. It was another example of the shifting explanations that had characterized her case from the beginning. And so, as you lie here in the darkness, listening to this story, you might wonder about the nature of deception and truth. You might think about Chad Enzel, 42 years old, excited for the new year, coming home from bowling that December night with no idea what awaited him. You might think about trust and how fragile it is. How we go through life assuming the people closest to us wish us well. The case raises questions that don't have easy answers. How long had Nikki been planning this? When she took out that renter's insurance policy 4 days before Christmas, was she already picturing Chad's death? When she and Earl kissed in the Walmart parking lot, were they already counting the insurance money? And what about Earl Howard, a Canadian man with a family of his own, who drove down to North Dakota and helped kill a man he didn't even know, all for a woman he'd been seeing for what couldn't have been more than a few months? What drives someone to cross that line, to go from infidelity to murder? Some people believe Nikki was the mastermind, that she seduced Earl into her plan with promises of a new life in Texas and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Others think Earl manipulated Nikki, though there's little evidence to support this. The truth, as always, is probably more complex. Two people finding in each other the permission to do something terrible, each one making the other's darkness seem more acceptable. The saddest part, perhaps, is thinking about Chad's family. His mother Deb, who spoke of a wound that would never heal. His sister Lori, who just wanted the jury to see her brother for who he really was. Not the monster Nikki had painted, but the kind, active, community-minded man who coached Little League and helped people improve their bowling game. There's a particular cruelty in having someone you love murdered, and then having to sit through a trial where the murderer paints your loved one as an abuser, as someone who deserved what happened. Chad's family had to endure that, hearing Nikki claim he beat her, that he was an alcoholic, that he was violent. And then they had to watch witness after witness have to testify to refute these claims, to defend Chad's character, to prove he was a good person. As if goodness protects you, as if being kind means you won't be betrayed. Today, the house on 43rd Avenue Northeast in Bismarck sits quiet. New owners perhaps, or maybe it stands empty, marked by the violence that happened within its walls. The bowling alley where Chad spent his Monday nights continues on, though there's one familiar face missing from the leagues. Interstate Power Company, where Chad worked, has other employees now filling the role he once held. The Little League teams have different coaches. Life moves on, as it always does, filling in the spaces left by absence. Earl Howard sits in a North Dakota prison, with at least 2 decades still to serve before he's eligible for parole. He'll be in his 60s by then. Most of his life spent behind bars for a crime that netted him nothing. No insurance money, no new life in Texas. No future with Nikki, just a cell and the knowledge of what he did. Nikki Ensel is in a different facility, serving her life sentence. She maintains her innocence, continues to claim she was a victim rather than a perpetrator. Perhaps she's even convinced herself. The human mind is capable of remarkable self-deception when the alternative is too painful to bear. But the evidence doesn't lie. The security cameras, the insurance policies, the timeline, the surveillance footage of them entering the house together while Chad bowled. The way the camera was turned off using her login right when Chad died. All of it tells a story that her shifting explanations can't erase. And now in the darkness of your room, as sleep begins to pull you down into its embrace, you might reflect on how this story, like so many true crime stories, is ultimately about ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Nikki and Earl weren't criminal masterminds. They didn't plan the perfect murder. In fact, their plan was full of obvious flaws. Security cameras they forgot about. Insurance policies that were too new and too convenient. Fires that wouldn't catch. Stories that didn't match. They were just people who wanted something they didn't have, and convinced themselves that the only way to get it was through violence. They were people who looked at an obstacle, Chad's life, and decided to remove it, as if a human being were no more significant than a piece of furniture in the way. That's the real horror at the heart of cases like this. Not the violence itself, though. That's terrible enough. But the coldness required to see someone you shared a home with, someone who trusted you, someone who helped raise your children, and think I can kill him. I will kill him, and then to actually do it. Chad Ensel went bowling on a Monday night in December. He came home, and he never left that house alive. Somewhere in the hours between 1 and 3 in the morning. As the old year gave way to the new, as the rest of Bismarck slept peacefully, 2 people he had reason to trust took his life. Justice in this case was served. The jury saw through the deceptions. The judge imposed appropriate sentences. Chad's family got their day in court, and the satisfaction of knowing his killers would spend decades in prison. But justice doesn't bring Chad back. It doesn't undo the betrayal. It doesn't heal the wound Deb Ensel spoke of. The one too deep to ever fully close. Let this story settle, now, as you settle into sleep. Let it remind you that life is precious and fragile. That trust is a gift not to be taken lightly. That every ordinary Monday night at the bowling alley is a blessing because it means you're alive, you're among friends, you're part of a community. Let it remind you, too, that darkness exists in the world, that betrayal is real, that some people choose terrible paths. But also remember that the system worked in this case. Investigators investigated, prosecutors prosecuted, juries deliberated carefully, and justice was done. In Bismarck, North Dakota, the snow falls in winter as it always has. People bowl on Monday nights. Little League teams practice in the summer. Life continues, carrying within it the memory of Chad Ensel, a man who loved life and lost it to people who loved only themselves. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.